They said the town never really slept. Even when the streets were empty, you could feel something watching. The fog never left, it clung to the houses, to your skin, to your breath. I came here looking for answers, but all I found were eyes. They don't blink, they don't move, just stare. And then one night I heard it, the sound of metal breathing. A scraping, a pulse, like the town itself was alive. That's when I saw it, crawling out of the smoke, half machine, half corpse, and very, very awake.
Drewster Elias Thorne stepped off the rickety train with a weighted breath, the acrid air of the mining town seeping into his lungs like a slow poison. The platform beneath his feet was cracked and dust-laden, the iron rails stretching endlessly behind him, swallowed by a horizon obscured in soot and smog. Above, the sky was a bruised grey, heavy with clouds that threatened rain but delivered only a persistent gloom. Somewhere in the distance, the ceaseless clatter of mining machinery thrummed a mechanical heartbeat that never ceased, even in the dead of night. He adjusted the lapels of his worn coat and took a tentative step forward, the sound of his boots muffled by the thick layer of coal dust that blanketed the ground. Around him, the town was silent in a way that unsettled him, not the peaceful silence of a slumbering village, but a breathless hush, as if the entire place were holding its breath, waiting for something unspeakable to unfold. Elias had arrived here on assignment, summoned by whispers of a strange affliction gripping the town, an insomnia so pervasive that no one truly slept, yet none seemed fully awake. The local physician had vanished months ago, leaving the community to wither under a veil of sleepless shadows. Elias, a man driven by a relentless curiosity and a desire to heal, had accepted the challenge despite the gnawing unease that tightened in his chest. His first encounters were with townspeople whose eyes betrayed the secret that words could not. Wide and unblinking, their gazes darted nervously, reflecting a jittery energy that made the very air around them crackle with tension. In the flickering gaslight of the streets, he saw faces pale and drawn, etched with lines deeper than age alone could explain. They greeted him with wary nods and half-smiles that never reached their eyes. In the tavern, a place thick with the smell of stale ale and coal smoke, Elias met Martha Crowley. She was a woman weathered by years of hardship, her strong features framed by a worn shawl that seemed to carry the weight of the town's history. Her voice was low and cautious as she spoke of whispers, voices that drifted on the wind, shadows that moved just beyond sight, and a restlessness that gnawed at everyone. "They don't sleep," she said, her eyes flickering with a mixture of fear and defiance. "Not like we do. They keep watch in the dark, but it's not the kind of watch that brings peace." Elias listened, his medical mind cataloging symptoms and behaviors, but beneath his clinical approach, a chill settled deep within him. There was something unnatural here, something that defied explanation and seeped into the bones of the town like a slow, spreading rot. Outside, the industrial skeletons of abandoned factories loomed like silent sentinels, their rusted machinery frozen in time, yet somehow alive in the oppressive atmosphere. The ever-present hum of distant machines was a dirge, a reminder of the town's prosperity and the price paid in sleepless nights and fractured minds. At his lodgings, a cramped room overlooking a narrow alley, Elias found no solace. Night after night, the sounds of the town's unrest seeped through the thin walls, the murmurs of the sleepless, the echo of footsteps that never ceased. He tried to close his eyes, but sleep was a stranger, slipping away just as it approached. His own journals grew thick with observations, questions, and a creeping sense of isolation. As the days passed, the lines between observer and participant blurred. Elias found himself drawn into the town's restless pulse, his sharp eyes mirroring the wide, unblinking gazes of the people around him. The insomnia was no longer a distant mystery, but a shadow that stretched its fingers into his own mind. And yet, amidst the encroaching dread, a stubborn determination burned within him. Whatever cursed this town, he would uncover it. For in the heart of this sleepless place, he sensed a truth darker than the coal-black nights, a truth that would challenge not only his skills as a physician but his very sanity. The town that never slept was watching him now, and Elias Thorne was about to learn that sometimes the deadliest nightmares are not those that visit in dreams, but those that stare back with eyes wide open. The night deepened, and the hum of the machinery grew louder, a relentless chant beneath the veil of stars. Elias sat by the window, pen poised over paper, his gaze fixed on the restless streets below. Somewhere in the distance, a child's cry fractured the silence, swift and sharp a reminder that the town's nightmare was far from over. He wrote, and the words spilled out like a confession, a first step into a darkness that promised no return. They sleep with their eyes open, he wrote, and I fear I may soon be one of them. Outside, the shadows lengthened, and the town held its breath once more. The air inside the small, soot-streaked room was thick with the smell of damp wool and coal dust. The faint flicker of a single oil lamp, casting a trembling yellow glow on the weathered face of the woman sitting opposite. Elias Thorne, her eyes unnervingly wide and unblinking, seemed to stare past him, fixed on some unseen terror lurking beyond the cracked window pane. "They come when the night is at its darkest," she whispered, voice trembling. "Shadows that move just beyond sight, whispering things I cannot understand. Sleep. It's like a stranger now." Elias took meticulous notes, his pen scratching against the paper as he listened to more accounts like hers. Each testimony revealed a uniformity of experience, a pattern of restless nights filled with haunting visions. The residents spoke of sleeplessness as if it were a malady shared by all, but with a sinister twist. Their waking hours were punctuated by fleeting glimpses of something monstrous, something that defied the boundaries of reality. Outside, the relentless hum of the mining machinery thrummed like a dirge beneath a sky choked with smoke and ash. The oppressive industrial landscape pressed down on Elias from every direction. The blackened buildings and tangled network of pipes and cables forming a labyrinthine cage around the town. As he walked the bleak streets, the weight of the environment seemed to seep into his bones, a physical manifestation of the dread that clung to the townsfolk. His next interview was with Samuel Rook, a man whose paranoia was as palpable as the grime on his threadbare jacket. Samuel's eyes darted nervously as he paced the cramped room of Elias' temporary office, his voice rising and falling in frantic bursts. "You don't see it yet, Doctor, but it's there. Beneath the surface. It's been here all along, feeding on us. The sickness isn't just in our bodies, it's in our minds, in the very air we breathe." Elias maintained a calm exterior, but inwardly he felt a growing tension, a knot of unease tightening in his chest. Samuel's warnings, though disjointed, echoed the fragmented visions reported by others. The doctor's rational mind struggled to reconcile these accounts with his medical knowledge. Insomnia caused by industrial stress was plausible, but the shared nature of the hallucinations hinted at something else, something far more disturbing. Night had fallen by the time Elias returned to his lodgings. The room was cold and silent, save for the soft creak of the wooden floorboards beneath his feet. He lit the oil lamp and settled at the worn desk, his journal open to a fresh page. Under the flickering light, he recorded the testimonies and symptoms, the recurring images of grotesque shapes and whispered voices that haunted the town. Each word deepened the shadows gathering in his mind, the boundary between observer and participant beginning to erode. As the hours stretched on, the oppressive atmosphere of the town seemed to seep through the walls, invading his thoughts and dreams. The hum of the machinery became a sinister lullaby, a constant reminder of the industrial graveyard surrounding him. Elias felt the first stirrings of a fear he could neither name nor dismiss, a creeping despair that whispered of a darkness lying just beneath the surface, waiting to be unearthed. He knew, with a cold certainty, that this was only the beginning. The affliction haunting the town was no simple disorder of sleeplessness. It was a shared nightmare, a collective wound etched into the fabric of their existence. And Elias Thorne was determined to unravel its terrible origin, no matter the cost. Yet, as he closed his journal and blew out the lamp, the shadows in the room seemed to deepen, coalescing into shapes that defied explanation. The town, it seemed, was already watching him with eyes wide open and minds lost in a waking dream. The investigation had truly begun. Dre. Elias Thorne sat alone in the fading light of the town's modest diner, nursing a cup of bitter coffee that did little to warm him against the chill that clung to his bones. The industrial skyline loomed beyond the window, skeletal structures of rusted girders and blackened smokestacks etched against a bruised sky. Here in this mining town whose name he had barely caught upon arrival. The air was thick with soot and something else, an intangible heaviness that seemed to press down on the soul. It was then that Martha Crowley approached, her footsteps quiet on the scuffed floorboards. She was a woman who carried the town's history in the lines of her face, weathered and unyielding. Draped in a worn shawl that seemed almost a second skin, her eyes held a steady resolve. Elias looked up, meeting her unwavering gaze. "Doctor," she said, her voice low but firm, "there are things you ought to know before you dig too deep." He inclined his head, curiosity mixed with professional caution. "I'm listening." Martha settled into the booth opposite him. "The insomnia, it's not just a sickness of the body. There are whispers, in the dark. They come from beneath the earth and creep through the town like a slow poison." Elias studied her closely, noting the slight tremor in her hands despite her stoic posture. "Whispers," she nodded. "Voices no one else hears or chooses not to. They speak of things buried long ago, things better left alone." Skepticism warred with something deeper within Elias. His training urged him to seek tangible causes, yet the pervasive unease he'd felt since stepping into the town urged caution. "Have you heard these whispers yourself?" "I have," Martha replied, her eyes darkening, "and I fear what they mean for all of us." The conversation lingered in his mind as Elias left the diner, stepping out into the gathering dusk. The streets were empty save for the occasional flicker of movement behind curtained windows. The hum of the mining machinery had slowed to an intermittent groan, swallowed by the encroaching night. Shadows lengthened and twisted, seeming to pulse with a life of their own beneath the flickering street lamps. As he walked, Elias caught faint murmurs carried on the cold wind, indistinct, yet undeniably present. His heart quickened. Were they the whispers Martha spoke of, or the product of an overworked mind? He pressed on, drawn deeper into the labyrinthine alleys, where the weight of history seemed to seep from the cracked pavement and crumbling walls. Returning to his sparse lodgings, Elias allowed himself a moment to breathe. The room was small and sparse, illuminated by a single flickering bulb that cast long shadows against the peeling wallpaper. Exhaustion tugged at him, but sleep was elusive. When it finally claimed him, it brought no relief. His dreams were a swirling tempest of fractured images, shadows that writhed beneath the earth, voices that whispered secrets in a language just beyond comprehension, faces contorted in silent screams. The line between nightmare and waking blurred, leaving him trembling in the darkness. He awoke gasping, sweat dampening his shirt, the echo of whispering voices fading into the dawn's cold light. Martha's warning, the strange visions, the oppressive atmosphere all coalesced into a gnawing dread. The town was not merely sleepless. It was haunted, and the whispers in the dark were the harbingers of a deeper, unfathomable horror. Determined yet wary, Elias resolved to uncover the truth buried beneath the surface, knowing that each revelation risked pulling him further into the abyss. The shadows lengthened once more beyond his window, and the town held its breath, waiting for the next chapter in its waking nightmare. The cold air of the mining town seemed to seep into every crevice of Dr. Elias Thorne's being as he settled into his modest lodgings. The oppressive weight of the industrial landscape outside smokestacks belching plumes that clawed at the bruised sky. The ceaseless drone of machinery was a constant reminder that this place was unlike any he had encountered. His first nights had been sleepless, not because of the town's mysterious affliction, but because his mind churned with questions he had yet to answer. It was on the third morning that Elias began his earnest collection of testimonies. The townsfolk were a jittery, hollow-eyed lot, their faces etched with exhaustion yet eyes unnervingly wide, unblinking as if perpetually caught in a waking nightmare. Their voices carried a tremor, a fragile edge that spoke of fear and something unspoken. The first to speak was Mrs. Agnes Larkin, a woman whose hands trembled as she clutched a faded shawl. Her small home reeked of damp wood and stale smoke, the only light a sputtering oil lamp that cast grotesque shadows across the peeling wallpaper. "Doctor," she whispered, voice cracking, "the nights are worse than the days. I see things. Dark shapes beneath the earth. They reach out, grasping at the edges of my mind." Elias leaned forward, his pen scratching furiously on the yellowed notepad. "Can you describe these shapes? What do they look like?" She swallowed hard, eyes darting to the window, as if expecting the shadows themselves to peer inside. "They're like nothing I've known. Shifting and writhing, like smoke made solid. They watch, waiting." Such descriptions were becoming common. Each account was a fragment of a larger, incomprehensible tapestry that Elias struggled to decipher. There was a pattern, not merely insomnia, but a shared, overlapping nightmare that haunted them all. The town's dim streets carried with them an echo of desperation that culminated one afternoon in a scene Elias would not soon forget. Samuel Rook, a former miner whose life had unraveled in the wake of a devastating accident, burst into the clinic without ceremony. His clothes hung loosely on his gaunt frame. His eyes darted wildly beneath unkempt brows. "You have to listen," he rasped, voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. "It's coming, the thing beneath us. It feeds on our waking hours, our sleepless minds. They don't see it, but I've seen it, felt it crawling through the tunnels, whispering in the dark." Elias regarded him carefully, noting the desperation but also the spark of something vital. "Tell me everything, Samuel. What have you seen?" The man's story was a chaotic weave of visions and warnings, a tapestry painted in shadows and broken light. He spoke of a monstrous presence, amorphous and shifting, that invaded the dreams of the townspeople, binding them in a collective terror that no amount of waking could dispel. As the days wore on, Elias found himself increasingly consumed by the testimonies. By candlelight, he would pore over notes, mapping connections between symptoms and dreams, each new detail tightening the noose of obsession around his mind. The oppressive hum of the mining machines outside seemed to sync with the pounding of his heart, a relentless rhythm that mirrored the town's collective unrest. One night, exhausted and restless, Elias succumbed to sleep and was plunged into a dream unlike any he had known. He found himself standing amidst a sprawling industrial wasteland, the sky swollen and bruised, shadows stretching long and oppressive. Faceless figures toiled endlessly beneath the watchful gaze of a monstrous silhouette that writhed and pulsed, a dark mass of decay and despair looming just beyond comprehension. He awoke gasping, sweat slick on his skin. The boundary between nightmare and reality blurred. The dream had been vivid, suffocating, an invitation or a warning. With this new understanding, Elias realized that the affliction was not merely physical. It was a psychic wound, a manifestation of collective trauma that had metastasized into something ancient and malevolent. The shared visions were fragments of a nightmare that bound the townsfolk together in a waking hell. But what was the entity? How had it come to infect this place, and why did it feed on their sleepless minds? Elias knew his investigation was only beginning, and that each answer uncovered seemed to lead deeper into shadow. Yet, despite the growing dread, he pressed on, driven by a stubborn hope that knowledge might yet bring salvation. As the night deepened beyond the town's restless gaze, the monstrous presence pulsed beneath the surface of consciousness, waiting patiently for the next fracturing mind to join its eternal lament. and somewhere in the darkness the nightmare whispered Elias' name. The weight of history settled heavily on Elias Thorne's shoulders as he delved deeper into the town's past. The oppressive atmosphere of the mining town clung to him like a second skin, but it was within the brittle pages of old records and forgotten journals that the true darkness revealed itself. The library, a cavernous room lined with dusty shelves and shuttered windows, became his sanctuary and his prison. Here, the past whispered with a voice as cold and unyielding as the iron beneath the earth. He sat hunched at a wooden table, poring over a worn leather-bound journal, its spine cracked and pages yellowed by time. The handwriting was jagged and hurried, penned by a miner named Thomas Halloway decades earlier. The entries painted a grim picture, sudden bouts of sleeplessness, spreading like a contagion, hallucinations of monstrous shapes lurking in shadows, and an overwhelming sense of dread that gripped the entire community. Thomas detailed the worsening mental state of his fellow miners, their eyes wide and unblinking, mirroring the symptoms Elias had witnessed firsthand. Elias's fingers trembled as he read the cryptic warnings, scrawled between the lines mentions of a ritual performed in desperate hope to bind the darkness that seeped beneath the town's foundations. The ritual, long forgotten and dismissed as superstition, was said to have quelled the nightmare temporarily, but the affliction had returned with a vengeance. The journal's final entries became increasingly disjointed, echoing the descent into madness that had claimed Thomas and many others. The oppressive hum of the mining machinery, outside filtered through the library walls, a constant reminder of the industrial heart that pumped life and death into the town. Elias felt the weight of generations pressing down on him, the legacy of exploitation and suffering etched into every brick and beam. It was a legacy that seemed to feed the restless nightmare, a festering wound beneath the surface of reality. A soft knock at the door interrupted his reverie. Martha Crowley entered quietly, her weathered face shadowed by the flickering lantern light. She moved with a solemn grace, carrying an air of ancient knowledge and unspoken sorrows. In her hand she held a fragile, folded paper worn and creased as if passed through many hands. "You need to see this," she said, voice low and urgent. "It's part of what they used long ago, to keep the darkness at bay." Elias unfolded the paper carefully, revealing a faded chant written in a looping script. The words seemed to pulse with a strange energy, a remnant of the ritual that once bound the entity beneath the town. Martha's eyes searched his, filled with a mixture of hope and despair. "The town has always been caught in this cycle," she whispered. "We live on the edge of something ancient and terrible." Days later, Elias found himself in the dim, smoke-filled corner of a decrepit bar. Samuel Rook, a former miner whose mind had frayed under the strain of the town's curse, leaned in close. His eyes darted nervously, his voice a frantic whisper. "They don't want you to know," Samuel rasped. "The elders, the bosses, they buried the truth with the bodies down the shafts. But it's all here, the price of their prosperity. The nightmares, the sleeplessness, they were not accidents." Elias listened, torn between skepticism and the chilling resonance of Samuel's words. The man's paranoia was palpable, yet beneath it lay a kernel of truth that refused to be ignored. The bar's stale air seemed to thicken, heavy with the weight of unspoken horrors, and the grinding machinery's relentless drone. Haunted by these revelations, Elias found himself drawn to the rusted iron bridge that arched over the sprawling industrial complex. The setting sun bathed the landscape in a sickly orange glow, casting long, twisted shadows that danced through clouds of coal dust. The air was thick and choking, filled with the metallic scent of rust and decay. He stood there, gazing at the sprawling maze of machinery and mine shafts, the veins of the town's lifeblood and its curse. The relentless clang of metal on metal beat like a dirge in his ears, echoing the rhythm of a heart long since corrupted. The legacy of industrial exploitation was not merely economic, it was a living, breathing horror that fed on the minds of those trapped within its grasp. Elias felt a cold sweat bead on his brow as the crushing despair settled deep within his chest. The nightmare was not a random affliction but a cyclical curse, woven into the very fabric of the town's existence. Each generation was doomed to suffer the same torment, bound by rituals forgotten and sins unatoned. His journal entries grew more erratic, the neat lines giving way to hurried scrawls and fragmented thoughts. The strain on his own mind was unmistakable. The boundary between investigator and victim blurred with every passing day. Yet, despite the mounting darkness, he could not turn away. The weight of history demanded confrontation, and Elias was determined, if doomed, to unearth the truth beneath the suffocating industrial nightmare. As night fell once more over the mining town, the oppressive silence was shattered by the distant, eerie howl of the wind through the empty shafts. Elias closed his journal and stared out into the darkness, knowing that the past was not dead. It breathed beneath the surface, waiting to reclaim the town and all who dwelled within it. The nightmare was awakening, and so was he. The cold, grey light of dawn filtered weakly through the grime-smeared windows of the tavern, casting long shadows that seemed to shift with a life of their own. Within, the air was thick with the metallic tang of stale beer and unwashed bodies. The usual low murmur of voices was shattered abruptly by a sudden, frantic intrusion. Samuel Rook stumbled inside, his clothes disheveled and stained with dirt and sweat, his eyes darting wildly as if pursued by unseen terrors. He clutched a trembling hand to his chest, gasping for breath as he raised his voice, hoarse and urgent.
"They're here!
The thing beneath us, the shadow in our minds!" "You have to listen, it's coming for us all." The room fell silent, save for the rasp of his ragged breathing. Patrons exchanged uneasy glances, some scoffing, others shrinking back, as if the very mention of the horror could summon it forth. Rook's words tumbled out in a torrent, fragmented and desperate. "I've seen it. In the mines, in the dreams whispering, twisting, devouring. The sleepless curse, it's not just a sickness. It's alive, feeding on our fear, our madness. We have to fight it before it takes us all." A burly miner rose, voice thick with suspicion. "Samuel, you've been out in the dark too long. Maybe you were the one losing your mind." Rook's eyes blazed with feverish intensity.
No!
"You don't understand. It's already inside us. It's in our waking hours now. We were all trapped in its nightmare." Before more could be said, a commotion erupted near the tavern's entrance. Elias Thorne, seated in a shadowed corner, rose quickly, his sharp eyes narrowing. A man, gaunt and trembling, was lashing out wildly, swinging a heavy fist at anyone who approached. The crowd recoiled, panic igniting like a spark in dry tinder. "Stop!" Elias called out, stepping forward cautiously. The man's eyes were wide and unseeing, pupils dilated into pools of madness. With effort, Elias subdued him, noting the faint sheen of sweat and the rapid, shallow breaths. The man collapsed into a heap, exhausted and broken. This was no isolated incident. Reports had begun trickling in, neighbors turning violent without cause, sudden fits of rage and despair gripping even the most stoic residents. The shared nightmare was no longer confined to sleep. It was bleeding into the waking world like ink spreading through water. Back in his office, Elias sat hunched over a cluttered desk, the dim glow of a single lamp casting long, flickering shadows over stacks of notebooks, medical charts, and hastily scribbled observations. The relentless hum of mining machinery thrummed through the thick walls, a ceaseless reminder of the town's industrial heart and its oppressive presence. He pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaustion and frustration warring within him. The symptoms were baffling, insomnia so pervasive it frayed the edges of sanity, shared hallucinations that echoed like a chorus of whispers in the collective mind, and now, violent outbreaks that threatened to unravel the fragile social fabric. His journals had grown erratic, a mirror to the chaos overtaking both town and self. Each entry was a desperate attempt to impose order on the mounting dread, to capture fleeting moments of clarity amid the encroaching madness. Late into the night, Elias found himself pacing the narrow confines of his room. The shadows cast by the flickering candlelight writhed and twisted like living things, mocking his futile efforts to hold reality intact. The air was thick, almost suffocating, heavy with unspoken fears and the echo of distant whispers that seemed to seep through the very walls. He paused, ears straining. A faint, unplacable murmur whispered just beyond comprehension, a susurrus of voices melding into a single, overwhelming presence. The entity was no longer a distant enigma. It was here, palpable and pressing against the fragile veil between sanity and madness. Elias shuddered, clutching the worn leather cover of his journal. The lines between dream and waking blurred, and with each passing hour, the grip of the entity tightened. Outside, the town stirred uneasily, its people caught in the grip of a nightmare they could neither wake from nor fully comprehend. And in the center of it all stood Elias, a solitary figure fighting to pierce the darkness, even as it threatened to consume him whole. As dawn approached, Elias understood with chilling clarity. The signs of madness were no longer mere warnings, they were the new reality. The question remained, haunting and relentless: how long before the entire town succumbed to the entity's insidious grasp? His hand trembled as he penned the final words for the night, the ink bleeding slightly on the page like a wound that refused to heal. We are running out of time. The nightmare is waking. And somewhere, deep beneath the cracked earth and rusted machinery, the nameless entity pulsed patient, eternal, and hungry. The night crept into the mining town like a slow, suffocating shroud, swallowing the last remnants of twilight and leaving a void filled only by the hum and clatter of machinery that never ceased. Elias Thorne sat alone at his desk, the small lamp casting a weak, flickering circle of light that barely pierced the oppressive darkness of his cramped room. The pages of his journal lay open before him, inked with frantic scrawls and disjointed notes, words looping back on themselves, sentences left unfinished. Thoughts unraveling with every stroke. The air was heavy, thick with soot and the metallic tang of the mines that lingered even here, far from the shafts and tunnels. A sudden flicker in the lamp's glow sent shadows dancing grotesquely across the wall's elongated limbs, twisting forms that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. Elias blinked hard, shaking his head as if to dispel the hallucination, but the shapes only grew more distinct, crawling along the plaster like dark tides. He pressed his palms to his eyes, willing the visions away, but when he opened them again, the room had shifted. The edges of reality blurred and warped, the familiar contours of his desk melting into a shifting landscape of industrial decay and nightmarish shapes. His breath quickened, heart pounding a frantic rhythm that echoed the distant clanging and whining of the machinery outside. The entity's presence was no longer confined to dreams or whispered rumors. It seeped into his waking mind, threading through his thoughts like a poison. He reached for his journal, desperate to anchor himself to something solid, but the words swirled on the page, letters rearranging into cryptic symbols that defied comprehension. Days passed, or was it hours? Time had become a fragmented illusion, each moment bleeding into the next without distinction. His sleep was fitful at best, punctuated by vivid, terrifying dreams that left him gasping for air, his eyes wide open but seeing impossible things. In these dreams, he wandered through the labyrinthine tunnels beneath the town, walls pulsing with a sickly, organic rhythm. Shadows coalescing into grotesque forms that whispered his name with voices like grinding metal. It was in this fragile state that Clara Thorne arrived, her presence both a balm and a blade. The estranged sister entered his room quietly, her footsteps hesitant on the worn floorboards. Elias looked up, startled by the intrusion, his sharp eyes meeting hers, guarded, tired and distant. Clara's pale face was framed by strands of dark hair, her features etched with the lines of years spent in emotional exile. "Elias," she began softly, voice trembling with a mixture of concern and exhaustion, "you slipping away. This place is doing something to you." Her words hung in the stale air, heavy with unspoken pain. He swallowed hard, the weight of isolation pressing down on him like the thick industrial fog outside. "I'm trying to understand," he whispered. "If I don't, no one else will." She shook her head, eyes glistening. "You're losing yourself. The town isn't just a place, Elias. It's a prison for all of us, even you." Their conversation spiraled into silence, the gulf between them widening with every passing second. Clara's presence reminded Elias of all the connections he had severed in his obsessive quest for answers, the emotional walls he had built to shield himself from despair. Later, wandering the deserted streets under a sky smothered by heavy clouds, Elias felt the town closing in around him. The fog curled at his feet, muffling his footsteps, while the clamor of distant machinery echoed like the heartbeat of some colossal beast. Shadows shifted at the edge of his vision, whispering secrets he could not grasp. Every turn seemed to lead deeper into a waking nightmare where reality and hallucination entwined relentlessly. Back in his room, the cracked mirror on the wall became a portal to his fractured psyche. Staring into it, Elias saw his reflection distort his gaunt face, splintering into shards that revealed monstrous shapes lurking just behind his eyes. The image flickered, a grotesque dance between man and nightmare, sanity and madness. He reached out, fingers trembling, but the glass was cold and unyielding, the reflection mocking his vulnerability. His journal entries grew increasingly erratic, pages filled with agonized questions and fragmented observations. The entity's influence was palpable, a dark veil blurring the boundaries of his mind. He was no longer certain if his perceptions were his own or seeded by the creeping madness that gripped the town. As the chapter closes, Elias sits alone, trapped behind the blurred veil of his own unraveling mind. The oppressive industrial landscape pressing against his consciousness like an unrelenting force. The line between waking and dreaming has dissolved, leaving him stranded in a liminal space where horror and despair intertwine an uncertain threshold from which there may be no return. The evening had slipped into a deeper shade of grey as Elias Thorne made his way toward the outskirts of the town. His footsteps soft against the cracked pavement slick with recent rain. The air was thick with the metallic tang of the mine, and the ever-present hum of machinery that never truly ceased. His mind churned restlessly, a storm of unanswered questions and growing unease. It was in this twilight that he sought out Martha Crowley, the stoic miner's wife, whose warnings had grown more insistent with each passing day. Her home was a modest, weather-beaten structure perched precariously near the edge of the mining district. As Elias approached, the faint flicker of candlelight seeped through the grimy windows, casting long shadows across the soot-streaked walls. When Martha opened the door, her strong-featured face was etched with worry. She ushered Elias inside without a word, the air thick with the scent of burning wood and old earth. "You shouldn't be poking around too deep," Martha said, her voice low and trembling, as if the very mention of the town's secret might summon unseen horrors. "There are things that don't want to be found. Things that watch with eyes no one can see." Elias regarded her carefully, noting the tremor in her hands as she clutched a worn shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I need to understand, Martha. If I don't, no one else will." Her eyes darkened, flecked with a fear born from years of silent suffering. "Understanding won't save you. It only makes the nightmare sharper. You ask questions, and the shadows listen." Despite the chill that crept along his spine, Elias nodded. "Then I'll tread carefully." The next day brought the town hall meeting, an event that had been called with growing urgency as the sleeplessness and strange behaviors worsened. The cavernous room, once a place of civic order, now felt more like a cage, its peeling walls and flickering gas lamps casting grotesque shapes across the faces of the gathered townsfolk. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed to pierce the dim light with an unsettling intensity. Elias stood near the front, his medical notes clutched tightly in his hands. Deputy Harris paced along the back wall, his stern gaze sweeping the restless crowd. Samuel Rook was there too, muttering feverishly to anyone who would listen, his wild eyes darting from face to face, as though searching for some sign of salvation. The meeting began with tense exchanges, voices rising and falling in a chorus of fear and frustration. But as Elias spoke of his findings, the shared nature of the visions, the fragmented nightmares that plagued the residents, a palpable shift rippled through the room. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the distant, mechanical thrum of the mine. Then, without warning, the atmosphere thickened and a collective shudder passed through the assembly. Eyes glazed over, breaths quickened, and faces contorted as if gripped by an unseen force. Elias watched in horrified fascination as the nightmare unfolded before him, not in sleep, but awake, shared by all. Visions of writhing, amorphous shapes, industrial decay bleeding into impossible geometries. And the suffocating pulse of the entity beneath reality filled the room's collective consciousness. The townsfolk's cries were silent but profound, their bodies frozen in terror as the monstrous presence invaded their minds. Samuel's frantic warnings crescendoed, his voice cracking as he shouted, "It's here! The curse!" We were all trapped. Deputy Harris moved to restore order, but even his commanding presence faltered against the overwhelming dread that gripped the crowd. Elias felt his own heart pound, the boundary between observer and participant blurring as the nightmare sought to claim him too. When the hallucination finally broke, a heavy, suffocating quiet settled over the room. The townsfolk, pale and shaken, slowly regained their composure, but the weight of shared horror lingered like a dark stain on the air. Later, as dusk bled into night, Elias stepped out onto the soot-streaked main street. The industrial skyline loomed around him like a monstrous cathedral of rust and shadow, its jagged silhouettes clawing into an oppressive sky heavy with smoke. The distant echoes of machinery and whispered fears wrapped tightly around the town, binding it in a waking nightmare from which there seemed no respite. Alone, Elias felt the crushing isolation descend, the knowledge that the town was held hostage not only by the entity but by its own collective torment. Yet within that despair burned a stubborn flicker of resolve, the need to confront the darkness, no matter the cost. But as Martha had warned, the deeper he delved, the more the shadows watched, and the more the nightmare tightened its grip. And somewhere beneath the surface, the nameless entity pulsed, waiting. The night was far from over. The miner's journal was discovered quite by accident, unearthed from beneath a loose floorboard in the backroom of the town's crumbling library. It was a fragile thing, bound in cracked leather and stained with the grime of decades. Elias Thorne sat alone at his rickety wooden desk, the dim glow of a lantern casting flickering shadows across the brittle pages. He traced the faded script with a trembling finger, the words whispering secrets long buried beneath layers of soot and time. The journal belonged to a miner named Jeremiah Calhoun, a man whose voice echoed with the tremors of dread and desperation. Jeremiah wrote of a strange affliction that had gripped the town nearly half a century ago, a restless waking nightmare that left the miners gaunt and haunted, their eyes wide and unblinking, even as their minds were lost to shadows. The sickness, he wrote, seemed born from the depths of the earth itself, a malevolent force that seeped through the tunnels and into the hearts of men. What chilled Elias most was Jeremiah's account of a ritual, a cursed rite performed beneath the surface in a desperate attempt to bind or banish the terrible presence. The miners, driven to madness by sleeplessness and visions of incomprehensible things, had gathered in secret, chanting words that twisted like smoke through the cavernous dark. But the ritual had not brought relief. Instead, it had bound the town to the entity more tightly, a pact forged in fear and blood. Elias paused, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him like the oppressive machinery humming outside his window. The entity was not merely a spectral horror haunting dreams, it was a curse etched into the town's very foundation. The prosperity of the mines came at a terrible price, the collective torment of every soul trapped within the town's grasp. The next day, Elias sought out Martha Crowley. She greeted him with her usual stoic composure, the worn shawl draped over her shoulders, seeming to carry the dust of years. With a steady voice, she led him through the labyrinth of abandoned mine shafts that still yawned beneath the town. Their footsteps echoed hollowly against the stone, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Martha recounted the whispered warnings passed down from her mother's time, tales of shadows that moved beneath the miners' lamps, and voices that hummed just beyond the edge of hearing. "They say the earth itself remembers," Martha murmured, her eyes scanning the darkness, "and it never forgets what men do to it." Elias listened, the oppressive silence pressing in on his senses. Each word felt like a thread unraveling a tapestry woven with madness and despair. He realized that the nightmare was not solely external. It was a manifestation of the town's collective trauma, an embodiment of the industrial decay and the haunted souls it had claimed. That night, Elias found himself plagued by fragmented visions. He dreamed of the tunnels collapsing, of monstrous forms shifting beneath the earth, their shapes grotesque and amorphous, the very entity described in the miner's journal. His own reflection in the cracked mirror seemed distorted, eyes hollow and rimmed with shadows. The line between his waking thoughts and the nightmare blurred, leaving him adrift in a sea of confusion and dread. A sudden howl shattered the silence outside his window, a sound raw and agonizing, cutting through the night like a blade. Elias sat frozen, the echoes of that primal cry reminding him that the curse was not confined to the past. It was alive, pulsing beneath the town's industrial heart. He closed the journal slowly, the leather cover creaking softly, and understood with a grim certainty that the nightmare was both external and internal. The entity fed on fear and madness, a dark legacy entwined with every breath the town drew. His investigation had uncovered a truth heavier than any stone. The miner's curse was eternal, a shadow cast long and deep, and Elias was now irrevocably part of its story. Yet in the depths of his despair, a small flicker of resolve remained. If the curse was born of forgotten rituals and buried sins, perhaps understanding it could offer a path through the darkness. But as the boundary between reality and nightmare grew ever more tenuous, Elias knew that the price of that knowledge might be his own sanity. The town's haunted legacy was a labyrinth with no clear exit, and every step forward risked plunging him further into the abyss. Outside, the industrial hum persisted, a ceaseless drone that seemed to mock the fragile hope kindling within him. The shadows lengthened, and the entity stirred in the collective dreamscape, waiting. Elias' journey into the heart of the town's darkness was only just beginning. He must confront the miner's curse or be consumed by it. And so, with the journal clutched tightly in trembling hands, Elias prepared to delve deeper into a nightmare that was waking and relentless. The air in the room thickened, the oppressive weight of history settling over him like a shroud. Somewhere beyond the walls, the entity whispered a nameless presence that promised only suffering and madness. Elias' eyes burned with sleepless determination, even as the shadows around him seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The nightmare was far from over, but Elias would not sleep, not yet. The mine shaft yawned before Elias like a cavernous maw, its darkness swallowed by the feeble glow of his lantern. The air was thick with the metallic tang of rust and the faint, sour scent of decay. Shadows danced erratically on the soot-streaked walls, and each flicker seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Elias took a cautious step forward, the gravel crunching beneath his worn boots, a sound that seemed unnervingly loud in the oppressive silence. He paused, eyes scanning the gloom for any sign of the monstrous shapes that had begun to invade the dreams of the townsfolk. And now, disturbingly, their waking hours. Around him, the faintest movements shifted just beyond the edge of perception, a writhing smear of darkness, a grotesque form that seemed to stretch and contract like a living shadow. It was as if the very mine itself breathed with the entity's malignant presence. Elias swallowed hard, forcing himself not to recoil. "This is no mere hallucination," he murmured, voice taut with unease. "The entity is here." His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden commotion echoing from the town hall, a place that had once been a symbol of order and community, now devolving into a crucible of chaos. Rushing toward the source of the uproar, Elias found the room packed with frightened, restless townsfolk, their wide, unblinking eyes reflecting a shared terror that no words could contain. Suddenly, a man wild-eyed and trembling shouted, voice cracking with hysteria, "The darkness comes! It seeps through the cracks! It watches us! We are all trapped!" He lunged forward, hands clawing at the air, and the crowd erupted into screams and frantic shoves. Elias pushed through the chaos, his heart pounding. "Calm down! We need order!" he shouted, but his words were swallowed by the rising tide of panic. The violent outbreak was no longer confined to dreams. It had spilled into the waking world, shattering the fragile veneer of sanity that had held the town together. Outside, Martha Crowley awaited, her weathered face set in grim determination. Her shawl fluttered in the cold wind as she grasped Elias' arm. "You shouldn't have come this far, Doctor," she warned, her voice low and trembling with urgency. "The entity grows stronger with every step you take. It feeds on our fear, our desperation. If you dig deeper, you risk everything." Elias met her gaze, the weight of her words sinking into his bones. "I have to understand it, Martha. If we don't confront this, the town will be lost." She shook her head slowly. Some truths are better left buried in the darkness. Their exchange was cut short by the arrival of Deputy Harris, his broad shoulders tense beneath his uniform. He pointed toward a shattered window pane, jagged edges catching the pale moonlight, and strange claw-like marks smeared across the grime-coated glass. "This happened last night," Harris said grimly. "No sign of forced entry, but the damage. It's unlike anything I've seen." Elias knelt to inspect the marks, the rough texture unsettlingly organic, as if scorched into the surface by some unnatural force. "The entity is crossing the threshold," he whispered. "It's no longer confined to dreams or shadows." The grim realization settled over them like a shroud. The town's nightmare was bleeding into reality, and the entity's presence was becoming an inescapable force. Inside the town, whispers of dread grew louder, rumors of shadowy figures glimpsed in alleyways, disembodied murmurs that seemed to seep from the very walls, and an oppressive weight that crushed the spirit of even the hardiest miners. The industrial decay that had long defined the town seemed to pulse with a new, malevolent energy, as if the old machinery itself was a conduit for the entity's dark will. Determined to act, Elias gathered what little strength remained in his fraying resolve. He convened with Martha and Deputy Harris, planning a watch to monitor the town through the long nights, hoping to catch any further physical manifestations before they could spiral into uncontrollable violence. But the entity was cunning. It slipped through the cracks of their vigilance like a living shadow, sowing discord and fear. Samuel Rook's frantic warnings grew more desperate, his once coherent rants now fractured by madness. One night, driven by a terror none could quell, Rook attacked a group of neighbors, his eyes wide and vacant, shouting of the darkness swallowing them all. The outbreak forced Elias into a grim confrontation with the reality of the horror he faced. No longer could he rely solely on medicine or reason. The entity was a force both cosmic and psychological, an embodiment of the town's collective trauma and the corrosive legacy of its industrial exploitation. As Elias stood amid the chaos, the shadows thickening around him, he understood that the battle was no longer just for the town's sanity, but for its very soul. The nightmare had taken shape, and to survive, he would have to face it directly regardless of the cost. And as the first light of dawn strained against the oppressive gloom, Elias felt the weight of the eternal dread settle deeper into his bones. The nightmare was no longer a dream. It was the waking world itself, and it was hungry. The cold dusk settled over the mining town like a thick, unyielding blanket, suffocating the last remnants of daylight as the oppressive industrial skyline cast long, skeletal shadows across the cracked streets. Just. Elias Thorne sat hunched behind his cluttered desk, the dim light of a flickering lamp illuminating the chaotic sprawl of papers, medical notes, and hastily scrawled journal entries. His eyes, sharp yet wary, darted rapidly between pages, attempting to extract order from the mounting chaos. Outside, the muffled sounds of restless townsfolk echoed faintly, a discordant symphony of whispered fears and restless footsteps that punctuated the night. Tonight, however, was different. The air thrummed with a palpable tension, a disquiet that seeped into every corner of the town. For weeks, Elias had observed the subtle fraying of the community's fragile cohesion, but now the threads began to unravel with terrifying speed. The tavern at the edge of the main square was a crucible of this unraveling. Shadows danced uneasily against soot-streaked walls, their flickering cast by a kerosene lamp struggling against a draft. Inside, a crowd gathered, their faces etched with exhaustion and suspicion. The usual murmurs of unease had grown into a cacophony of paranoia. At the center stood Samuel Rook, the former miner whose descent into madness had become a grim spectacle for the town. His clothes hung loosely on his gaunt frame, his hair unkempt, and his eyes darting wildly like trapped animals searching for escape. His voice, once measured and cautious, had fractured into frantic, incoherent rants that sliced through the tavern's thick, stale air. "They're coming! Can't you see? The shadows, they're alive! Watching, waiting!" The entity feeds on us, devouring our minds one sleepless night at a time. Samuel's voice cracked, his hands trembling as he gestured wildly, knocking over a mug that shattered on the floor. The sharp crash silenced the room momentarily, the tension snapping taut. Few dared to approach him now. Some exchanged wary glances, others edged away, their eyes wide and unblinking in the dim light. The collective fear was a living thing, a creeping fog that seeped into their bones. Elias knew Samuel's warnings were no longer the ramblings of a troubled man, but the desperate cries of a mind shattered by the entity's grasp. Outside, the night deepened. The hum of the mining machinery persisted, a relentless mechanical heartbeat that echoed the town's own restless pulse. Elias could feel it in his bones, a ceaseless rhythm that offered no reprieve. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near the back of the tavern. Two men, faces flushed with exhaustion and suspicion, clashed violently over a whispered accusation. The first shoved the second with unwarranted force, igniting a physical altercation that quickly spiraled out of control. Chairs scraped harshly against the wooden floor, shouts and curses filled the air, and the fragile barrier of civility shattered like brittle glass. Elias, standing at the periphery, felt a cold dread wash over him. The violence was both a symptom and a catalyst, the town's collective madness manifesting in raw, brutal form. He stepped forward, attempting to intervene, but the crowd's chaos swallowed his voice and resolve alike. Retreating, Elias found himself alone in the labyrinthine streets, the industrial silhouettes looming ominously against the starless sky. His breath came in shallow gasps as a creeping paranoia gnawed at his mind. The relentless insomnia that plagued the town now threatened to consume him utterly. Back in his office, the shadows seemed to crawl along the peeling walls. The flickering lamp cast grotesque shapes that played tricks on his wary eyes. His journal lay open before him, a testament to his unraveling grip on reality. The neat handwriting had given way to frantic scrawls, each word a desperate attempt to capture the intangible horrors that stalked both the waking world and the dreamscape. A sudden knock at the door jolted him from his spiraling thoughts. It was Martha Crowley, her weathered face etched with concern beneath the worn shawl that she always wore. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, held a fierce urgency. "Elias," she whispered, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation, "you re-digging too deep. The entity's grip tightens with every question you ask. The town's breaking, can't you feel it? If we push further, we'll lose what's left of our minds." He looked up, the exhaustion and despair reflected in his eyes. "But to stop this, To save them, I have to understand. Martha shook her head slowly. Some truths aren't meant to be uncovered. The deeper you go, the darker it gets. Her words hung heavy in the stale air, a harbinger of the darkness closing in around them all. Elias felt the walls of his own sanity crumbling. The town was fracturing, and with it, his last vestiges of hope. As the night deepened, the violence, the paranoia, and the creeping madness wove an inescapable tapestry of dread. Elias sat back down, the weight of the town's unraveling pressing down like the oppressive machinery that surrounded them. Somewhere beyond the veil of waking and dreaming, the nameless entity pulsed with malevolent life, feeding on the fractures in human minds. And Elias knew, though he fought to deny it, that the nightmare was far from over. The shadows lengthened, the silence thickened, and the fractured minds of the town slipped further into darkness. The question lingered in the cold air: could any light survive in a place where hope was already a ghost? But Elias would not rest. Not yet. Not while even a flicker of resistance remained. Yet, deep inside, a voice whispered, sometimes louder than reason, that perhaps the battle was already lost. And in the suffocating stillness, the town waited, eyes wide open, trapped in its own unraveling dream. The town seemed to breathe beneath Elias Thorne's feet, a grotesque and living thing, pulsing with a rhythm that was both mechanical and organic. As he closed his eyes, surrendering to the pull that had grown irresistible over the past weeks, the oppressive weight of reality dissolved into something far more sinister. The air thickened, heavy with the metallic scent of rust and decay, as the landscape around him warped into a nightmarish dreamscape. The sky bled iron-red hues that stretched endlessly, casting twisted shadows over the ground that pulsed like a living wound. Elias found himself standing alone on a cracked and trembling surface, the remnants of mining equipment protruding like skeletal fingers from the earth. A low hum echoed a chorus of distant machinery and whispered voices that seemed to crawl beneath his skin. The oppressive atmosphere wrapped around him like a shroud, and the eyes he had so often observed in the waking town now appeared before him, the faceless, silent townsfolk trapped in eternal torment. Their mouths were frozen in silent screams, and their eyes were empty voids, reflecting the endless suffering of the collective nightmare they shared. "Why do you come here, Doctor?" A voice slithered through the air, not spoken but felt, a presence that chilled the marrow of his bones. It was the nameless entity, formless yet tangible, a swirling mass of shadows interlaced with fragments of rusted chains, broken tools, and the echoes of anguish. Its grotesque shapes shifted endlessly, never settling, always writhing in a dance of despair and decay. Elias steadied himself, gripping the fading thread of his rational mind. "To understand," he whispered, voice trembling. "To end this." The entity responded with a cascade of incomprehensible whispers, ancient and alien truths that tore at the fabric of his sanity. Memories not his own flooded his mind, generations of suppressed fear, betrayal, and sacrifice buried beneath the town's cold, dark soil. He saw the faces of miners long dead, their hopes and horrors entwined with the machinery that fed the town's prosperity at a terrible cost. As the visions intensified, Elias felt his identity splintering. The boundaries between dream and reality, between victim and perpetrator, blurred into a maddening haze. His own fears and guilt intertwined with the collective trauma, creating a tapestry of cosmic horror that threatened to consume him entirely. In a fleeting moment of clarity, Elias reached out, desperate to sever the entity's hold. His hands passed through the shifting shadows, grasping at a fragment of light that flickered weakly in the darkness. But the grasp was futile. The dreamscape buckled and collapsed, plunging him into an abyss of endless darkness and silence. He fell, weightless and alone, swallowed by the void that mirrored the emptiness growing within his mind. The nightmare was no longer just a shared affliction. It was an eternal prison, a cosmic trap from which there was no escape. And as Elias drifted in the darkness, the last vestiges of his sanity slipping away, he understood the horrifying truth. Some nightmares are not meant to end, but to be endured endlessly, with eyes wide open. Yet beneath the despair, a faint spark lingered, a fragile thread of resistance woven from the depths of human will. Whether it would endure or be snuffed out by the encroaching void remained uncertain. But for now, Elias was lost in the dreamscape, a solitary figure confronting the unspeakable, caught between the waking world and the nightmare that held the town captive. The dream was endless, the horror infinite, and the town, forever sleepless, waited with bated breath for what would come next. The oppressive silence shattered as Elias awoke, gasping, drenched in sweat. His journal lay open on the bedside table, the ink smeared from trembling hands. The boundary between nightmare and waking life had thinned beyond repair. He knew his quest had only just begun, and that the true confrontation with the darkness still awaited him beyond the fragile veil of sleep. The first light of dawn crept hesitantly over the mining town, a pallid wash of grey that seemed almost reluctant to disturb the oppressive stillness. Dra? Elias Thorne emerged from the cramped confines of his lodging, his limbs heavy with exhaustion that no sleep could wash away. The town lay before him like a half-remembered nightmare, skeletal towers of rusted iron and shattered glass, their jagged silhouettes clawing at a mist-thickened sky. The fog clung stubbornly to the cracked streets, swallowing sound and bending the world into a blurred, indistinct tableau. Even the hum of the mining machinery, once ceaseless and relentless, had dulled to a ghostly whisper, a pulse beneath the earth that seemed to resonate with the dark entity Elias had faced in the collective dreamscape. The air was thick with the metallic tang of rust and the faint, acrid scent of coal dust, a constant reminder of the town's industrial heart, now stilled and crumbling. As Elias walked, his senses felt betrayed by the shifting shadows at the edges of his vision. Shapes twisted and recoiled, as if the very fabric of reality was fraying. The entity's presence lingered, a suffocating weight pressing upon his mind, warping perceptions and drawing him into a void of cosmic indifference. He shivered not from cold, but from the raw, gnawing dread that clawed at the edges of his sanity. Back inside his room, the walls seemed to breathe with a slow, sinister rhythm. Elias's journal lay open on the worn desk, pages stained with smudged ink and trembling fingerprints. His eyes darted across the scrawled notes and fragmented observations, but the words blurred and doubled as he struggled to anchor himself to reality. The metallic scent mingled with the stale air, thickening like a fog inside his mind. He pressed a hand to his temple, feeling the cold sweat trickle down his face. The dreams, the shared nightmare, were no longer confined to the night. Their echoes haunted his waking hours, twisting thoughts and distorting memories. Voices whispered from the shadows, half-formed and indecipherable, promising oblivion and endless unrest. A knock interrupted the oppressive silence. Elias looked up as Martha Crowley entered, her weathered face etched with worry beneath the worn shawl draped over her shoulders. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, reflected the flickering lamplight as she spoke in a low, urgent tone. "It's no use, Doctor. The void hungers, and it grows stronger every day. This town is caught in its grasp, and none of us are safe." Elias met her gaze, searching for some flicker of hope amid her somber warning. "Is there truly no way to break free?" She shook her head slowly. "We've tried to hold on to what little we have, but the darkness seeps deeper. Each of us carries a piece of the nightmare, stitched into our bones." The weight of her words pressed down on Elias, mingling with his own growing sense of helplessness. The entity was no longer a distant cosmic horror, but an intimate terror, woven into the very fabric of their existence. Later, at the edge of town, Deputy Harris awaited him beneath the skeletal remains of the last mining structure. The man's stern features were softened by exhaustion, eyes clouded with the resignation of one who had seen too much yet could do so little. They stood side by side, gazing out toward the barren horizon where the sky met the earth in a cold, unyielding line. No birds sang, no wind stirred. Only the faint echo of the void resonated in the stillness. This place, "It's dying," Harris murmured, voice low and heavy. "And so are we." Elias nodded, the truth of the statement settling like a stone in his chest. The collective nightmare had not been vanquished. It had only deepened its hold, leaving the town and its people to wither in its shadow. As the sun struggled to break through the fog, Elias felt the last threads of his resolve fray. The entity's echo was everywhere inside his thoughts, in the silence between words, in the oppressive air that pressed down upon them all. There was no escape, no awakening from this shared slumber. And yet, in that bleak moment, a flicker of something stubborn and fragile remained, a will to bear witness, to record the horror before it swallowed them whole. Elias returned to his journal, hands steadier now, and began to write, the words a trembling testament to the void that echoed endlessly within and without. The nightmare endured, a living shadow cast over the town that slept with its eyes open, forever haunted and alone. But beyond the veil of despair, a faint question lingered. Could the human mind endure when the void was no longer outside, but within? The air in the small, musty parlor felt thick and unyielding, as if even the walls themselves bore the weight of years of silence and regret. Drear. Elias Thorne sat rigidly in the stiff wooden chair, his gaunt figure hunched forward, eyes shadowed and hollow beneath heavy lids that had long ceased to truly rest. Across from him, Clara Thorne folded her hands neatly in her lap, her pale face framed by loose strands of dark hair, her expression unreadable yet unmistakably distant. Between them, the space pulsed with the echo of unspoken words, a gulf carved deep by years of estrangement and the relentless strain of the town's affliction. "You don't have to carry this burden alone, Elias," Clara finally said, voice low and steady, though it lacked the warmth he so desperately needed. "But you push everyone away, even me." He swallowed, the dryness in his throat a familiar companion. "I don't know how to do this any other way," he murmured. "The town, it's slipping further into madness. I feel it gnawing at me, Clara. At all of us." She shifted slightly, the faintest flicker of sorrow passing through her eyes before the carefully maintained distance returned. "Maybe some things are beyond saving. Maybe you need to accept that." The words hit him like cold steel, their finality settling over him like the ever-present industrial smog outside. Elias wanted to argue, to plead for hope, but the truth gnawed at his resolve. The town was caught in a ceaseless unrest, its people trapped in a waking nightmare that no medicine or reason could cure. That night, Elias returned to his clinic, the familiar sanctuary now feeling like a prison. The walls bore the stains of soot and neglect, shadows lengthening beneath the dim glow of a lone lamp. He opened his journal, its pages thick with hurried notes, fragmented observations, and the mounting evidence of his unraveling mind. His pen scratched relentlessly, attempting to impose order on the chaos that consumed him. Each entry seemed to spiral deeper into despair, words blurring as exhaustion and obsession entwined. Outside, the distant clatter of machinery hummed a monotonous dirge, a reminder of the town's relentless industrial pulse. The air hung heavy with the scent of rust and coal dust, seeping through the cracked windows and settling into the very marrow of the town. Elias closed his eyes briefly, but sleep remained elusive. The same relentless insomnia that plagued the townsfolk now gripped him firmly, refusing release. Days passed in a haze of solitary labor and fractured interactions. One evening, as rain slicked the streets and the sky darkened to a bruised purple, Elias encountered Martha Crowley. Her weathered face was illuminated faintly by the flickering street lamp, the worn shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders offering scant protection against the chill. "You were losing yourself, doctor," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "This town eats at the soul. You must be careful how deep you dig." Elias met her gaze, searching for some thread of hope amid the resignation. "I can't stop now. Not when so many suffer." She sighed, her eyes flickering toward the looming silhouette of the mines. "Hope is a fragile thing here. Don't let it break you." Her words lingered long after she had disappeared into the night. a fragile lifeline tethered to a sinking ship. But Elias could feel the weight of isolation pressing ever tighter, his connections fraying as the town's nightmare deepened. Later, near the edge of the industrial complex, where rusted machinery loomed like forgotten giants, Elias found himself confronted by Deputy Harris. The man's skeptical eyes narrowed as he regarded the wary doctor. "You rechasing shadows, Elias," Harris said, voice gruff but edged with reluctant concern. "This town's problems aren't all in your head, but you no savior." Elias shook his head, frustration bubbling beneath his exhaustion. "I'm not giving up, not yet. There has to be a way to break this cycle." The deputy's jaw tightened, uncertainty flickering behind his stern facade. "Maybe. But you're not the only one carrying this burden." Their brief exchange ended with a silent understanding, two men bound by a shared helplessness against an invisible foe. Elias turned away, the cold wind biting at his cheeks as the oppressive weight of the night pressed down. The town remained trapped in its unrest, and so too was he caught between fading hope and encroaching madness. Back in the clinic, Elias returned to his journals, the pages now a chaotic tapestry of despair, fragmented memories, and desperate attempts at clarity. His thoughts spiraled, blurring the lines between waking and dreaming, reality and nightmare. The faces of the townsfolk haunted him empty, wide-eyed, trapped in a shared horror that none could escape. As dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in sickly shades of gray, Elias paused. The exhaustion etched deep lines on his face, but his eyes remained unblinking, reflecting the hollow promise of another sleepless day. Somewhere beyond the haze of his unraveling mind, a question lingered: was salvation possible, or was he merely another lost soul swallowed by the town's eternal unrest? The chill of isolation wrapped around him like a shroud, and the creeping dread whispered that the nightmare was far from over. Yet Elias, battered and broken, refused to let go. Not yet. Outside, the industrial hum continued unabated, a relentless heartbeat echoing the town's suffocating grip. And within the shadows, the nameless entity thrived, pulsing beneath the surface of broken dreams and fractured minds, waiting for the next flicker of resistance to consume. The night stretched endlessly ahead, and Elias' wary gaze searched the encroaching darkness for a sign, a spark of light to pierce the suffocating gloom. But all that remained was the echo of silent screams and the unyielding grip of isolation's cruel embrace. And so the town slept with its eyes open, caught forever between waking and nightmare, while Elias stood alone at the precipice of madness, his soul tethered to a horror that refused release. As the first light of morning bled weakly through the grime-streaked windows, Elias closed his journal and whispered to the silence, "There must be a way. There must be a way." But the only answer was the endless hum of the town, a dirge for the lost and the damned. The police station's faded green walls seemed to shrink inward under the weight of the silence, broken only by the distant, metallic thrum of machinery that never ceased. Deputy Harris sat behind his cluttered desk, arms crossed tightly, his scowl deepening as Dr. Elias Thorne paced before him. The doctor's voice was lower now, cautious but insistent, weaving fragmented theories about shared nightmares and an insidious presence that gnawed at the town's collective mind. "I don't know what you want me to do with this," Harris grunted, glancing once toward the window, where the gray light of dusk faded into the smog-choked night. "People around here don't take kindly to strangers poking into their business, especially when it makes them look crazy." "This isn't just about business, Deputy," Elias replied, his sharp eyes catching the faint twitch of unease beneath the lawman's skepticism. "There's something wrong here, something that's deeper than insomnia or superstition." Harris leaned forward, the lines on his face etched by years of hard living and harder nights. "You think it's some kind of, what? Ghost? Demon?" Elias shook his head. "Not a ghost, not something of this world, but it's real. It manifests. I've seen it, felt it. The townsfolk are trapped in this waking nightmare, and it's feeding on them, on all of us." The deputy let out a bitter laugh. "You and me both, Doc." But chasing shadows won't fix anything. Their uneasy truce was shattered by a sudden pounding at the door. Harris moved swiftly to open it, revealing Martha Crowley, her weathered shawl wrapped tightly against the chill seeping through the cracked window panes. "You need to see this," she said, her voice low, edged with urgency. "The entity, it's growing stronger." Outside, the night was thick with the choking smoke of the mines, the sky a dull canvas smeared with industrial grime. Elias, Harris, and Martha moved together toward the old factory district, where rusted conveyor belts and skeletal frames of forgotten machinery loomed like the bones of some ancient Leviathan. As they neared a cracked window, a shadow flickered, a grotesque, shifting shape that seemed to defy the very laws of form. It writhed and twisted, a mass of darkness punctuated by fleeting glimpses of something vaguely humanoid, then vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. Elias swallowed hard, his breath catching in his throat. "It's here." Harris, usually so steady, felt a cold prickle crawl up his spine. "Christ, I don't like this." The air around them grew heavy, vibrating with a subtle pulse that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The ground beneath their feet throbbed faintly, as though the town's tortured history was alive, breathing beneath layers of rust and soot. Martha's voice broke the tense quiet. "Generations of exploitation, fear, and violence, these are the chains that bind us. The entity feeds on them, on the suffering buried deep in this soil. It's why the town never sleeps, why our minds are trapped in that endless nightmare." Elias looked at her, the weight of her words settling over him like a shroud. "Then it's not just the entity. It's everything this town has become." Harris nodded slowly, his skepticism giving way to grim determination. "If we were going to face this, we do it together. No more running from what's under our noses." Together they began to trace the invisible threads that connected the industrial decay, the collective madness, and the entity's insidious presence. Each revelation deepened the oppressive atmosphere, but also strengthened their bond, a fragile alliance forged in the shadows of despair. Yet as they moved forward, Elias couldn't shake the gnawing thought that these unseen chains might be stronger than any of them, binding them not just to the town's past, but to an eternal nightmare with no end. The night stretched on, thick with whispers and half-glimpsed horrors. Somewhere in the distance, the relentless pulse of the mines echoed, a grim reminder that beneath the surface, the town's dark heart still beat, and the nightmare endured. And in that pulse, Elias understood some horrors were not meant to be broken free from, but endured, carried like a weight that would never lift. He glanced at Deputy Harris, whose jaw was set with stubborn resolve, and then at Martha, whose eyes held the wary knowledge of generations. The path ahead was uncertain, shadowed by the unseen chains that held them all. But there was no turning back now. The nightmare was growing stronger, and so must they. "You think this place was cursed from the start," Harris muttered, kicking a piece of rusted metal. "Not cursed," Martha answered, her voice steady but mournful. "Wounded. Left to rot by those who only cared for the profits." Elias knelt beside a cracked plaque, its inscription faded but still legible. "To the men who toiled beneath these grounds, may their sacrifices not be forgotten." "Sacrifices," Elias repeated. "Sacrifices that feed the darkness." Harris spat on the ground. "Have you seen what desperation does to people? What fear does? And now it's a beast that feeds on that fear," Elias said softly. The wind carried a distant, eerie whistle, the sound of a mine shaft venting, or perhaps a sigh from the town itself. "We need to be ready," Harris said, glancing toward the shadows. "Because whatever this thing is, it's not finished with us yet." Elias nodded, the weight of the unseen chains tightening around his chest. The nightmare was far from over. The basement was heavy with the scent of damp stone and flickering candle wax. The low murmur of whispered voices, threading through the cramped space like fragile strands of defiance. Martha Crowley stood at the center, a pillar of resolute strength amidst the gathering of wary faces drawn tight with exhaustion and fear. Her shawl, frayed and faded from years of wear, draped over her shoulders like a banner of endurance. She scanned the room with eyes sharp as flint, catching every tremor of doubt and flicker of desperation that threatened to unravel the fragile tapestry of hope she sought to weave. "We cannot let this darkness swallow us whole," she intoned, her voice steady despite the tremble that lurked beneath. "We've lived through hell before, and we will do so again. But only if we stand together." A hush fell over the group, the air thick with the weight of unspoken fears. Outside, the ceaseless clatter of the mining machinery thrummed like a heartbeat, a grim reminder of the town's unyielding grasp on its cursed prosperity. The oppressive industrial landscape pressed in from every side, its rusted skeleton looming beyond cracked windows, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. Elias Thorne lingered in the shadows near the back, his gaunt frame hunched, eyes dark rings of sleepless nights and relentless obsession. The doctor's journal lay open in his lap, pages fluttering as if stirred by an unseen breath, but his attention was not on the scribbled notes. It was on the faces surrounding him, faces drawn with the sharp lines of grief and determination, yet flickering with the fragile light of resistance. His mind wrestled with the paradox of hope blossoming amid a garden of rot. Martha's gaze found his in the dimness, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. She was the town's unyielding heart, a guardian against the encroaching madness that sought to claim every mind like a ravenous tide. Yet even she bore the marks of the struggle, lines etched deep by sleepless nights, eyes clouded with shadows that no candle could dispel. "We hear the whispers," she said, voice barely above a breath, "the voices that crawl beneath our skin and twist our thoughts. But we must not let them silence us." From the doorway, the heavy footsteps of Deputy Harris echoed a reluctant sentinel caught between law and the inexplicable terror gripping the town. His broad shoulders filled the frame as he stepped inside, face set in a mask of skepticism tempered by the hard-earned knowledge of things beyond reason. The room shifted with the weight of his presence, a tension threading through the gathered souls like a taut wire. He exchanged a glance with Martha, a fleeting moment heavy with unspoken truths and fragile alliances. Taking a seat at the edge of the circle, he folded his arms, eyes scanning the group with cautious resolve. The uneasy truce was palpable. Law enforcement and townsfolk united not by certainty, but necessity. "I don't believe in ghosts," Harris muttered, voice low and gruff. "But whatever's out there, it's tearing this place apart." Murmurs rippled through the room, a mixture of agreement and fear. Elias felt the lines between observer and participant blur as the doctor's analytical mind wrestled to anchor itself amid the swirling chaos. His journal grew heavier with each entry, chronicling not just symptoms and strange behaviors, but the fragile human spirit fighting to endure. Outside, the night pressed in like a living thing. The industrial maze stretched beneath a sky swollen with heavy clouds, the rhythmic pounding of the mining machines a relentless dirge. Shadows danced grotesquely along the rusted pipes, twisting into shapes that mocked sanity itself. The entity's presence was a suffocating fog, seeping into every corner, whispering promises of oblivion and despair. Within the basement's fragile sanctuary, voices rose in quiet determination. Plans were whispered, small acts of rebellion against the creeping madness, rituals to preserve the last flickers of tradition and hope. Martha's eyes burned with fierce conviction, a beacon in the gathering gloom. Yet Elias knew the truth lurking beneath the surface. The entity was watching, sensing the stirrings of resistance, and it would not relinquish its hold without a merciless struggle. The town's descent was far from over. The nightmare's claws dug deeper with every passing hour. As the meeting drew to a close, Elias closed his journal with a heavy sigh. The fragile hope kindled here was a candle flickering against an unrelenting storm. He looked to Martha and Deputy Harris, their faces etched with the same wary determination. "We hold on," Martha whispered, "because if we don't, who will?" The doctor nodded, words caught in the tight cage of his throat. Outside, the metallic heartbeat of the machines thundered on, a grim reminder that the town's nightmare was far from finished. And so, beneath the watchful eyes of rusted towers and whispering shadows, the last embers of resistance struggled to breathe, fragile and fleeting against the suffocating dark. But even as they gathered strength, the entity stirred, its amorphous form pulsing just beyond perception, ready to smother hope once more in its endless, hungry void. The struggle was only beginning. Night had begun to fall over the mining town, but the darkness offered Elias Thorne no respite. In his clinic, the small lamp on his desk cast long, wavering shadows that seemed to dance with malevolent intent. The steady hum of the machinery outside, once a background noise, had twisted into a sinister chorus of whispers and muted cries. He rubbed his eyes, trying to dispel the creeping fog that clouded his vision, but the shadows at the edges of his sight refused to fade. Shapes flickered vague, shifting forms that vanished when he blinked but left a lingering sense of dread. His journal lay open, the ink smeared by restless hands as his thoughts scattered like the broken fragments of a shattered mirror. Medical knowledge, once a sturdy anchor in the storm of his investigations, now felt like a feeble raft cast adrift on a sea of nightmare. The symptoms of the town's affliction had seeped into his psyche, blurring the lines between observer and participant. He questioned every sound, every movement, as if the very walls whispered secrets best left unheard. A sharp knock on the clinic door startled him. "Elias, are you in there?" Clara's voice was tentative, carrying the cold distance that had grown between them over the years. He hesitated before opening the door, revealing his sister's pale face framed by the dim light. Her eyes searched his, reflecting concern and awareness he knew all too well. "Clara," he murmured, voice rough. "I didn't hear you come in." She stepped inside, folding her arms as she studied him. "You look worse than the last time I saw you. The town's wearing on you." Her words, though softly spoken, struck like blows. Elias averted his gaze, unwilling to admit the torment that clawed at his mind. "It's not just the town," he confessed. "It's inside me now. The dreams, the visions, they won't let me go." Clara's eyes flickered with a mixture of pity and frustration. "You need to rest, Elias. But I know that's impossible here." Their conversation was interrupted by the distant clang of machinery, a relentless reminder of the industrial behemoth that loomed over the town like a dark god. The oppressive presence seeped through the cracked window pane, filling the room with a tangible weight. Later, as Elias wandered the town square, he encountered Martha Crawley. Her weathered face was set in a grim expression beneath the worn shawl that had become her constant companion. The fog hung low, muffling the sounds of the restless town. "Doctor," she said quietly, you fraying at the edges. "The town's madness is seeping into you, just as it has into all of us. You must be careful how deep you dig." Elias met her gaze, feeling the heavy truth behind her words. "But if I don't dig, who will? The nightmare will consume us all." Martha's eyes darkened. "Sometimes knowing is a curse worse than ignorance." As night deepened, Deputy Harris patrolled the empty streets. The flickering streetlights cast unsettling shadows that seemed to writhe and slither along the cracked pavement. His footsteps echoed in the silence, a solitary rhythm in a town unraveling at the seams. The lawman's stern face betrayed his growing helplessness. His enforcement was no match for the creeping madness suffocating the community. Back in his clinic, Elias sat slumped over his desk, the weight of his unraveling mind pressing down like the oppressive machinery outside. His journal entries grew more erratic, a stream of consciousness that blurred fear, paranoia, and desperation. The nightmare was no longer confined to the dreams. It was leaking into every waking moment. He reached for his pen, hands trembling. "If this is to be my last record," he wrote, "let it be a testament to the fragility of the human mind when besieged by forces it cannot comprehend. The town's madness is mine now." A sudden knock at the door jolted him upright. Outside, the shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own, and Elias realized with a shudder that the boundary between nightmare and reality had all but dissolved. The fraying threads of his sanity trembled on the edge of rupture, and the town's collective madness threatened to swallow them all whole. The darkness was waiting, patient and eternal. The tavern was a cavern of shadows, broken only by the flickering light of a single lantern hanging askew from a rusted hook. The air was thick with stale smoke and a simmering tension that seemed to coalesce around Samuel Rook's trembling frame. Elias watched him from the far corner, his gaunt face illuminated by the lantern's weak glow, eyes darting wildly as if each shadow might leap to claim him. "You don't understand," Samuel rasped, voice cracked and urgent. "It's not just insomnia, not just nightmares. It's the entity. It's eating us from the inside out. I've seen it. In the mine shafts, in the dreams, in the eyes of those who've lost themselves. It's here, Elias. It's here, and it's hungry." Elias leaned forward, the weight of exhaustion pressing into his bones. "Samuel, I've heard your warnings, but we need evidence. We need to understand what we're dealing with. Evidence." Samuel's laugh was bitter, a dry rasp that seemed to draw the shadows closer. "The evidence is the madness spreading like wildfire. The violence, the rage, the empty gazes. You think you can fight this with medicine or reason. It's beyond us. Beyond everything." The conversation was cut short by a sudden commotion outside. A scream ripped through the night, sharp and raw, followed by the chaotic clatter of feet pounding against cobblestone. Elias and Samuel rushed outside, the cold night air biting at their skin, carrying the metallic tang of blood and the acrid stench of smoke. In the town square, a scene of carnage unfolded. Figures moved erratically, their eyes unnaturally wide and unblinking, faces contorted in grotesque expressions that twisted human pain into something monstrous. The clang of machinery from the nearby mine melded with the screams, creating a dissonant symphony of industrial horror and human suffering. Elias' heart pounded as he tried to make sense of the violence. A man lunged at him, wild and desperate, but Elias dodged, using the briefest moment to push past the crowd. The entity's influence was palpable, a suffocating presence that seemed to thicken the air and sap his strength. Amid the chaos, Elias caught sight of Samuel, cornered by a group of frenzied townsfolk. Despite his frailty, Samuel fought with a desperate fury, his voice rising above the din in frantic pleas and warnings. Then, suddenly, the violence turned tragic. A blow struck Samuel down, his body crumpling to the ground as the mob surged past, leaving him broken and silent. The shock of Samuel's death crashed over Elias like a tidal wave. The man's warnings, once dismissed as paranoia, now echoed with a grim finality. The town was unraveling, its fragile veneer of sanity shattered beyond repair. Later, Elias found himself standing alone on a rain-slick street, the cold droplets stinging his skin as smoke curled from burning buildings. The industrial skyline loomed like a dark specter against the stormy sky, an eternal reminder of the town's decay and despair. In this desolate moment, Elias felt the crushing weight of isolation, the knowledge that the battle ahead might be his last. Inside a small, dimly lit room, Martha Crowley cradled Samuel's lifeless form. The flickering lantern cast long shadows, dancing across her weathered face etched with grief and fierce determination. She whispered prayers, old words steeped in superstition and hope, offering a fragile bulwark against the encroaching darkness. "We cannot let this end here," she murmured, her voice steady despite the tears glistening on her cheeks. "There is still a fight to be fought." Elias returned to her side, the resolve in her eyes rekindling a spark within him. The nightmare was closing in, but he would face it, no matter the cost. The storm was gathering, and the final confrontation loomed like a jagged horizon, inevitable, terrifying, and absolute. As the night deepened, the town's restless whispers grew louder, threading through the heavy silence like a dirge. Elias knew the fragile line between salvation and oblivion was razor thin. The entity fed on fear and madness, a monstrous force born from the town's own suffering. To confront it was to gaze into the abyss, risking everything. He opened his battered journal, the pages stained with ink and sleepless nights. There, he mapped out a plan not just to understand, but to challenge the unbearable truth. The nightmare would not consume him without a fight. Outside, the storm raged on, a tempest echoing the turmoil within. The gathering storm was not just in the skies, but in the hearts of the wary and haunted. Elias steeled himself for the coming descent into darkness, where hope flickered like a dying flame against the relentless night. Tomorrow, he whispered to the empty room, I will face it. And with that vow, the chapter of despair edged toward its climax, the fragile threads of sanity stretched to breaking, the town teetering on the precipice of eternal madness and oblivion. The air thickened around Elias as he closed his eyes, surrendering to the deep pull of the dreamscape once more. The oppressive hum that had haunted the town for months crescendoed within his mind, a vibration that seemed to seep into his bones, unrelenting and vast. When he opened his eyes again, the bleak landscape of the mining town was gone, replaced by an otherworldly wasteland where twisted metal structures loomed like skeletal sentinels over an abyssal void. At the edge of a yawning chasm, the ground beneath Elias, feet crumbled into shadowy nothingness, and a cold wind whispered through the jagged remnants of rusted machinery. The sky above was a swirling mass of industrial smoke and starlit darkness, an impossibly vast expanse that seemed to stretch into infinity. Around him, faint echoes of voices, fragments of memories and screams twisted together with the clanking of gears and the distant cries of lost miners, weaving into a haunting symphony of despair. Elias took a hesitant step forward, the sensation of his own body growing faint, as if he were dissolving into the dream itself. Each breath brought with it a taste of soot and decay, mingled with a metallic tang that clung to his tongue. Before him, the nameless entity began to take form. It was not a creature, but a shifting amalgamation of nightmares, a writhing mass of rusted gears entwined with shadowy tendrils that pulsated like a living heart. Faces, distorted and grotesque, emerged from the darkness, their hollow eyes staring into Elias' soul. The entity's form trembled and undulated, morphing between shapes that defied comprehension, as if the very essence of the town's trauma and industrial blight had coalesced into this obscene presence. A low, otherworldly hum rose from the entity, vibrating through the air and into Elias' very core. It was a sound that spoke of ancient suffering and cosmic indifference, a resonance that shattered the fragile barrier between sanity and madness. Elias felt his mind strain against the weight of the entity's presence, memories of the town's tragedies, the faces of lost miners, the whispered curses of forgotten rituals, all fused into a relentless tide of despair. "Why do you come?" A voice echoed within the void, neither male nor female, but a chorus of anguish and menace. Elias could not tell if it spoke from the entity or from the deepest recesses of his own fractured psyche. "I seek understanding," Elias replied, his voice barely a whisper yet somehow reverberating through the dreamscape. "I seek to end this nightmare." The entity pulsed, its form rippling as if amused by the futility of his quest. "There is no end," it murmured. "Only the eternal cycle of waking and dreaming, of eyes open and minds captive. We feed on the silence between your thoughts, on the fractures of your hope." Elias felt the ground shift beneath him, the edges of his own form flickering and blurring. He was becoming part of the entity, his identity dissolving into the chaotic mass. The faces in the shadow twisted, merging with his own reflection until he was both observer and consumed. Visions cascaded through his mind, miners lost to madness, families broken by despair, the relentless machinery grinding down both flesh and spirit. The town's history was not just a backdrop, but the very fabric of the entity's existence, a tapestry woven from decades of suffering and exploitation. As Elias struggled to hold on to himself, he realized the terrible truth. This was no mere hallucination or isolated affliction. The nightmare was the town itself, an eternal purgatory where consciousness was trapped in a state of sleepless torment, feeding the insatiable hunger of an unknowable cosmic horror. Desperation clawed at Elias' mind, but resistance felt futile. The entity's voice echoed once more, a chilling promise and curse intertwined. You belong here now, as we all do. The abyss does not release its own. In that moment, the boundaries between dream and waking dissolved entirely. Elias felt his essence pulled deeper into the abyss, swallowed by the endless void that was both external and internal. The suffocating weight of eternal unrest pressed upon him, and in the depths of that darkness, he understood there was no escape. Yet even as despair threatened to consume him, a faint spark of defiance flickered within Elias' shattered mind. Though trapped, though broken, he resolved to bear witness to the horror, to record the nightmare for those who might one day seek the truth. The abyss whispered on, endless and indifferent, as Elias' form faded into the swirling shadows and rusted echoes of the town that never truly slept. And somewhere beyond the veil of reality, the nameless entity pulsed with a dark, eternal hunger waiting, watching, feeding on the fragile minds caught in its grasp. The nightmare endured. The price of understanding due to Elias Thorne sat motionless at his desk, the dim glow of a solitary lamp flickering erratically against the cracked glass window. Outside, the industrial town lay swathed in a suffocating darkness punctuated by the faint, relentless hum of machinery long since silenced, but never quite silent in memory. The room was strewn with pages from his journals, each scrawled line a testament to his unraveling mind. His fingers trembled as he traced the inked words, each a fragment of the nightmare that had become his existence. Each a shard of the collective horror binding this town and its people in eternal unrest. He had come here as a healer, a man of science determined to solve a medical mystery and insomnia that was no mere lack of sleep, but a torment deeper and darker than any disease had encountered. Yet now, the boundary between doctor and patient, observer and participant, had all but vanished. The knowledge he had uncovered was a weight impossible to bear. The nightmare was not external alone, nor internal alone, but a cosmic amalgam of suffering, trauma, and something ancient and unknowable that pulsed beneath the town's very foundations. "You rechasing shadows, Elias?" a voice said softly in the doorway. Martha Crowley stepped inside, her weathered face etched with a mixture of fear and resolve. "Some truths aren't meant to be found. You know that now." He looked up, meeting her steady gaze. "But if I don't understand it, how can we hope to fight it? To save anyone?" Martha shook her head slowly. "There's no saving what's already lost. This town, this place is caught in the entity's grip. It's eternal, a cycle that feeds on fear and madness. You're not just fighting it out there." She gestured vaguely toward the mind's shadow depths visible through the grimy window. "You're fighting it inside yourself." Her words echoed the gnawing truth Elias had felt creeping into his thoughts. He was no longer merely the investigator. He was a victim, a prisoner of the same nightmare that had claimed the town. His own dreams, if they could still be called that, were a maelstrom where the entity's grotesque shapes writhed and beckoned, a labyrinth with no exit. A sudden crack of thunder rattled the window panes, the storm outside mirroring the turmoil within. The air thickened, heavy with the metallic tang of unseen decay. Elias closed his eyes, and when he reopened them, the room seemed to twist. The peeling wallpaper curled into crawling tendrils, and the lamp's light flickered into grotesque shapes that shifted and melded into the amorphous form of the nameless entity. He gasped, heart pounding, as the industrial landscape outside transformed in his vision into endless tunnels, each lined with the faces of sleepless townsfolk, their eyes wide and unblinking, mouths open in silent screams. He staggered back into his chair, clutching his head as the hallucination receded, but left behind a suffocating sense of cosmic insignificance. The entity was not just a creature of nightmares, but a manifestation of the town's collective trauma and the dark legacy of exploitation that had poisoned generations. Later that evening, Elias found himself standing alongside Deputy Harris beneath the oppressive canopy of night. The deputy's usual skepticism had given way to a reluctant understanding born of witnessing horrors no badge could shield from. They stood in silence, the town's restless eyes seeming to glimmer from every shadow, a living testament to the nightmare that consumed them all. "It's hopeless," Harris muttered, voice low and gravelly. "But maybe we hold on to what little we've got left." Elias nodded, the fragile solidarity between them a brief beacon in the encroaching void. But even as he grasped for that sliver of connection, the knowledge he bore gnawed at his soul. The nightmare was eternal. And the price of understanding was a descent into despair from which there might be no return. As the night deepened, the town that slept with its eyes open remained trapped in a cycle of suffering, the collective nightmare pulsing beneath the surface of reality, forever binding Elias and its people in a shared and unending horror. Yet still, somewhere deep within, a flicker of defiance lingered, a whisper against the cosmic void, a fragile hope that perhaps the story was not yet finished. But the question remained unanswered and haunting. Could knowing the truth ever be a key to salvation? Or was it simply another chain in the endless nightmare? The shadows lengthened, and the nightmare endured. The sun had long since dipped below the jagged horizon of the mining town, leaving behind a sky smeared with bruised purples and dull oranges, the kind of twilight that seemed to bleed into the heart of the landscape itself. Elias Thorne stood motionless at the edge of the main street, his gaunt figure silhouetted against the dying light. The buildings before him, once bustling with the clang of industry and the rhythm of human toil, now sat in decay, their soot-blackened facades crumbling and their windows vacant like hollow eyes watching silently. A cold wind stirred, carrying with it the faint hum of the distant machinery that had never truly ceased beneath the earth, a relentless heartbeat that pulsed through the veins of the town. Elias's eyes, wide and unblinking, scanned the scene with a hollow detachment. It was as if the light itself were draining from his gaze, leaving nothing but a vacant shell where curiosity and hope had once flickered. He took a slow step forward, the gravel crunching beneath his worn boots, each sound amplified in the stillness that clung to the streets like a shroud. The air tasted metallic and dry, thick with the residue of coal dust and forgotten sorrows. Despite the outward calm, an oppressive weight pressed down on Elias's chest, a suffocating reminder of the endless wakefulness that gripped every soul in this forsaken place. Inside a modest, dimly lit house on the edge of town, Clara Thorne watched him from across a rickety kitchen table. Her hands rested on the worn wood, fingers intertwined tightly as if to steady herself against the tide of helplessness that rose within her. The room was sparse, lit only by a flickering oil lamp that cast long shadows upon peeling wallpaper stained by time and neglect. "Elias," she said quietly, her voice threading through the silence like a fragile lifeline. "You're slipping further away. I can see it. You have to fight this fight for yourself, for the town." But Elias's gaze was distant, unfocused, fixed on some point beyond the cracked window pane, where the night began to gather its dark dominion. The lines of anguish etched into his face deepened, his lips parted as if to speak, but the words failed to form. Instead, he inhaled sharply, his breath shaky, and retreated further into himself. Clara's eyes glistened with unshed tears, a mixture of frustration and aching love twisting her features. "I'm here," she whispered. "We're still here. But you have to come back to us." Outside, the industrial graveyard awaited, a sprawling necropolis of rusted carts, shattered rails, and skeletal frameworks that clawed at the steel-gray sky. Elias found himself drawn there once more, as though the remnants of the mines held a morbid invitation. Each step through the twisted metal was a descent deeper into the marrow of the town's suffering. The silence was broken only by the occasional distant clang, a metallic echo that reverberated through the hollow spaces, mimicking the fractured rhythm of Elias's own thoughts. Shadows lengthened and merged, dancing in grotesque shapes that teased the edges of his vision. He clenched his fists, fighting the urge to succumb to the creeping madness that whispered promises of oblivion. Returning to his sparse room, Elias lit a candle whose trembling flame cast a fragile glow over the scattered pages of his journals and medical notes. His hand shook as he reached for a pen, compelled to chronicle the unraveling of his own mind and the relentless nightmare that gripped the town. Words spilled forth in vivid scrawls, disjointed, looping, desperate attempts to grasp a truth that slipped like smoke through his fingers. The darkness outside pressed close, a living entity that seeped through cracks and crevices, entwining with the shadows within. Elias felt the walls close in, the barrier between nightmare and waking dissolving into a suffocating haze. His breath quickened, heart pounding as the candle flickered violently before plunging the room into darkness. In that enveloping blackness, Elias understood the cruel certainty of his fate. The town was a prison of endless wakefulness, a collective dream from which there was no escape. His mind, once a tool of reason and healing, now lay fractured beneath the weight of shared trauma and cosmic indifference. Clara's distant voice echoed faintly in his memory, a tether to a world slipping ever farther away. Yet as the shadows deepened, Elias felt himself fading, his light dimming, swallowed by the eternal dusk that claimed the town and all who dwelled within it. And as the night stretched on, unyielding and infinite, the town remained trapped in its waking nightmare, eyes wide open but souls forever lost. The candle's flame sputtered once more, then vanished, leaving only the silence and the darkness that waited. Would Elias find the strength to reclaim his shattered self, or would he too become another ghost among the shadows, swallowed whole by the town that sleeps with its eyes open? The question lingered, unanswered, as the fading light died. The grey sky hung low over the town as dusk settled into an unforgiving twilight. Martha Crowley stood in the center of the town square, her silhouette framed by the flickering glow of dozens of candles arranged carefully on the cracked cobblestones. The air was thick with dampness. The cold seeped into the bones of the few gathered souls, their faces drawn and pale, eyes wide and hollow yet alert. Around them, the industrial skeletons of the mines loomed silent now, but ever present as a reminder of the town's ceaseless suffering. Martha's shawl, worn and threadbare, wrapped tightly around her shoulders against the chill. Her strong features were etched with lines of hardship and determination, her eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight with a fierce, unyielding hope. She lifted her voice, quiet but resolute, reciting a prayer mingled with old superstitions and pleas for mercy. The townsfolk echoed her softly, a fragile chorus struggling against the oppressive silence that clung like a shroud. Around them, shadows stretched long and distorted, the rustling leaves whispering secrets carried on the wind whispers that seemed to come from the very heart of the mines, from the dark veins beneath the earth where the nameless entity pulsed unseen. The faint hum of machinery, long since stilled, lingered in the ears like a maddening refrain, a reminder that the nightmare endured beyond the waking world. Meanwhile, in a small, dimly lit room not far from the square, Elias Thorne sat hunched over his journal. The only illumination came from the flickering flame of an oil lamp, its light casting dancing shadows on the cracked plaster walls. Shadows that morphed and writhed like restless spirits. His gaunt face was pale, eyes sharp but wary, rimmed with dark circles from countless, sleepless nights spent chasing the intangible. His pen moved feverishly across the yellowed pages, filling them with a meticulous record of symptoms, observations, and fragmented thoughts. Each word was a desperate attempt to impose order on the chaos that had swallowed the town and himself. The journal had become more than a medical log. It was a testament to the horror that was eroding the very fabric of sanity. The silence in the room was punctuated only by the scratching of ink and the occasional distant echo of voices from the vigil below. Elias paused, his hand trembling, and stared out the window. Beyond the glass, the town seemed suspended in a dreamlike stillness, its residents caught in an unending vigil of sleepless torment. Later that night, a soft knock disturbed the fragile quiet. Clara Thorne entered hesitantly, her pale face a stark contrast to the gloom surrounding her brother. Her eyes, distant yet searching, met Elias' wary gaze. Words were scarce between them, strained, fragmented attempts at connection in a world steadily unraveling. "Elias," she said softly, "you can't carry this burden alone." He shook his head, a bitter smile flickering and fading. "I must. For them, for this town." Their conversation wove between silence and fleeting exchanges, a fragile tether in the encroaching darkness. Outside, the unblinking eyes of the town seemed to watch, a silent audience to their fractured humanity. As the vigil drew to a close, a sudden chill swept through the gathering. Candle flames flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows that stretched and twisted unnaturally. A murmur, indistinct yet pervasive, rose from the edge of hearing, as if the very air vibrated with the entity's presence. The townsfolk exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down upon them. Martha's voice faltered for a moment, but she steadied herself, raising her hands as if to shield the group from the encroaching dread. Yet the silence that followed was heavier than before, a suffocating reminder that the nightmare was far from over. Back in his room, Elias closed his journal with a heavy sigh. The pages were filled with the final observations of a town lost to its own shadowed mind, a record of despair and fleeting hope. He knew, as he did every night, that the vigil was both a stand and a surrender, a fragile flicker against the consuming darkness. Outside, the night deepened, and the town that slept with its eyes open remained trapped in the eternal vigil of its own making, caught between waking and nightmare, hope and despair, sanity and madness. The nameless entity watched, patient and eternal, waiting for the next breath of fear to feed upon. And within Elias Thorne, a question echoed: could any light truly pierce the all-encompassing shadow? Or was this the last vigil, not just for the town, but for the very soul of those who dared to remember what they had lost? The candles guttered low, their flames trembling in the thickening dark, as the town held its breath and the nightmare endured. The descent was inevitable, a slowly encroaching darkness that swallowed every shard of Elias Thorne's once steadfast mind. It began in the quiet moments between sleepless nights, where shadows danced too long on the edges of his vision, and the hum of the mining machines mutated into a sinister symphony only he could hear. His journal lay open before him, pages stained with trembling ink and half-formed words that twisted into incoherence. The boundaries that once separated his clinical detachment from the surreal nightmare of the town's affliction had shattered, leaving behind a man adrift in a sea of his own unraveling thoughts. Elias found himself drawn back to the abandoned mining tunnels, a place where the air hung heavy with the scent of rust and stale earth. Each footstep echoed with a hollow clang that seemed too loud, too unnatural. The walls, slick with moisture and grime, appeared to pulse, as if the very stone breathed with some grotesque life. Strange whispers slithered through the darkness, their source impossible to pinpoint, but their menace unmistakable. The oppressive weight of the darkness pressed upon him, a physical force that squeezed at his chest and blurred his vision. In this suffocating void, his hallucinations grew vivid. Faces morphed from the blackness, twisted visages of the townsfolk contorted in silent screams, their eyes hollow and accusing. He saw Clara's distant gaze flicker with despair before dissolving into shadow. His own reflection fractured in the cracked surfaces around him, multiplying into grotesque caricatures of his fractured psyche. The monstrous entity that plagued the town seemed to leak into his waking world, its presence a suffocating fog that clouded reason and memory. Back in his office, the flickering gaslight cast jittery shadows over his cluttered desk. Elias grasped at his journals, desperate to anchor himself to some semblance of reality. But the words swam and twisted, the ink bleeding into shapes that no longer made sense. The steady mechanical drone outside became a relentless chant, a dirge marking the slow death of his sanity. He scribbled frantic notes, his handwriting devolving into frantic scrawls as the walls of logic crumbled. His rare encounters with Clara were marked by a profound distance, a chasm widened by unspoken grief and his growing instability. On one rain-soaked evening, beneath a sky heavy with storm clouds, they met in a deserted street. The cold drizzle clung to their skin, mingling with the bitter taste of regret. Elias reached out, voice cracking, pleading for connection, but she recoiled, her eyes reflecting a sorrow too deep for words. The looming silhouettes of rusted machinery and derelict buildings framed their fractured reunion, the oppressive environment a bleak reminder of all that was lost. Martha Crowley's visits became both a balm and a torment. Her steady presence amidst the chaos offered fleeting comfort, her voice a whisper of ancient fears and stubborn hope. In the flickering light of his home, she spoke of the town's curse and the price of its prosperity, her words heavy with the weight of generations. Yet, even as she tried to anchor Elias to the fragile reality, unseen shadows writhed just beyond the windows, feeding the paranoia that gnawed at his mind. Each day, the veil between nightmare and waking life thinned, until it was little more than a thread about to snap. Elias' descent was a mirror to the town's own decay, both trapped in an endless loop of dread and despair. His medical knowledge, once a shield, now felt impotent against the creeping madness. The collective trauma of the community, the toxic legacy of industrial exploitation, and the cosmic horror embodied by the nameless entity conspired to erode every fragment of his identity. The chapter closes on Elias standing alone in the darkened streets, eyes wide and unblinking, mirroring the sleepless faces of the town. The oppressive hum of machinery fades into a low growl, and shadows gather like a living tide. The nightmare is no longer something outside him, it has become the core of his being. As the cold wind bites through the empty avenues, the question lingers in the air, how long before the last light of sanity dies entirely? And with that harrowing thought, the story propels forward, the descent deeper into madness inevitable and irrevocable. The sun had long vanished behind the thick, choked horizon of smoke and rust, leaving the mining town bathed in a dim, bruised twilight that seemed to seep into every crevice and shadow. Jutta Elias Thorne stepped quietly onto the cracked pavement, his boots barely disturbing the thin layer of ash and grime that coated the streets. Around him, the town was a skeleton of its former self, yet it breathed a slow, labored inhalation of despair and decay. The residents wandered with a peculiar stillness, their eyes wide open yet glazed, reflecting the flickering gaslights overhead with a vacant intensity that unsettled Elias to his core. They moved like phantoms tethered to a waking nightmare, their faces expressionless, lips parted as if perpetually caught between breaths. The air was heavy with an unnatural silence, broken only by the distant, mechanical groans of mining equipment, a dirge for a dying town. Elias's gaze flicked to a woman standing at the corner, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders despite the stifling air. Martha Crowley's presence was a rare anchor amid the drifting emptiness. Her weathered face was drawn tight with worry, eyes sharp beneath furrowed brows. She beckoned him softly, guiding him toward a dimly lit tavern that reeked of stale smoke and unspoken fears. Inside the tavern was a cavern of shadows and whispers. Elias's footsteps echoed hollowly as he took in the gathered townsfolk, pale, twitching figures whose blurred outlines seemed to waver against the flickering lamplight. Their conversations were hushed, voices slipping into the stale air like serpents, curling with menace and secret dread. Martha's voice was low but firm. "You feel it too," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "The shadows aren't just absence, they listen, they watch. The entity is here, always here." Elias swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling on his chest like a stone. "How do you know?" "Because it whispers, in dreams, in waking moments. It clings to the edges of our minds, fraying what's left of us." Before Elias could respond, a sudden disturbance drew his attention. Samuel Rook emerged from a narrow alley outside, his figure trembling under the jaundiced glow of a flickering street lamp. His eyes darted wildly, a frantic storm of fear and desperation. They were everywhere, Samuel hissed, voice cracking, in the walls, the shadows, the spaces between breaths. They were swallowing us whole. You can't fight what you can't see, but I see. I hear. Elias moved closer, trying to steady the man's shaking form. Calm down, Samuel. What is it you're hearing? Whispers, Samuel gasped. Not just voices, promises, threats, the cold scratch of eternity. They want us to forget ourselves, to become nothing but echoes. The air thickened with a palpable tension as Elias absorbed the gravity of Samuel's words. The entity was no longer a distant spectre, but an omnipresent force, its influence threading through the very fabric of the town and its people. Later, in the dim confines of the police station, Elias found Deputy Harris hunched over a battered desk. The officer's usual skepticism had been eroded by a creeping unease that shadowed his every movement. "I've seen things," Harris confessed quietly, eyes flicking nervously toward the dark corners of the room. "Shadows that move against the light, whispers that crawl through the halls. I told myself it was stress, exhaustion, but it's more." Elias nodded, the shared confession binding them in a fragile alliance against the growing darkness. As the night deepened, Elias wandered back into the streets, the cold breath of the entity pressing close. The people were no longer themselves husks animated by a shared nightmare, their identities dissolving into a singular, creeping madness. The town had become a cage, its bars forged from shadows and whispered horrors. In this suffocating atmosphere, Elias felt the first true tremors of his own unraveling. The boundary between observer and participant blurred. The nightmare was no longer contained within others, but seeped into his own mind, threatening to consume what little remained of his reason. And yet, amidst the desolation, a faint ember of resolve glimmered. To confront the nameless entity was to confront the abyss itself, a task as inevitable as it was impossible. Elias knew the path ahead was fraught with peril, but the town's fate, and perhaps his own, depended on his courage to face the shadows among them. The night stretched endlessly, a tapestry of darkness and silence woven thick with dread. And somewhere, beyond the veil of waking and dreaming, the entity stirred, waiting to draw them all deeper into the void. The cracked mirror hung crookedly on the peeling wall of Elias's small rented room, its surface fragmented into 1,000 jagged shards of glass. He stood before it, eyes wide and unblinking, as if willing the fractured images to coalesce, to offer some semblance of unity. But each shard reflected a different facet of his worn face, some gaunt and hollow-cheeked, others twisted with silent screams, others still barely human, warped by shadows that seemed to cling to his flesh like smoke. The dim light of the gas lamp flickered uncertainly, casting trembling shadows that danced mockingly across the crooked frame. Elias reached out, fingertips trembling, and touched the cold glass. The surface was rough at the cracks, shards threatening to cut him, yet he pressed harder. His breath fogged the mirror, distorting the fractured images further, until the faces merged into a swirling nightmare of eyes, mouths, and hollow forms. A low, metallic hum vibrated through the room, the ever-present pulse of the town's machinery, relentless and oppressive. The reflection blinked, but it was not his own eyes that moved. Instead, a shadow slithered behind the glass, twisting and elongating into grotesque shapes that writhed in silent torment. Elias staggered back, heart pounding, but the image remained, a cruel reminder of the fracturing within. Outside, the streets of the mining town writhed in the fog. Buildings leaned at impossible angles, the soot-darkened facades cracked and bleeding with rust stains. The air was thick with the scent of oil and decay, mingled with the faint, sickly sweet odor of something organic, something not quite alive. Whispered voices slithered through the alleys, indistinct but laden with menace, echoing the collective nightmare that gripped the town's soul. The clanging of distant machinery was no longer merely sound, but a heartbeat, a monstrous pulse driving the madness deeper into every crevice. Elias stumbled outside, drawn by the cacophony but repelled by the warped reality. His breath came in ragged gasps as he walked the fractured streets, each step threatening to plunge him into a deeper abyss of insanity. Faces appeared in the fog, familiar yet distorted, flickering like ghosts trapped between worlds. He caught sight of Clara across the street, her figure blurred and hesitant, a pale beacon in the oppressive gloom. Their eyes met briefly, and Elias felt the cold sting of estrangement cut through him. He approached, the distance between them charged with unspoken history and pain. In the cramped kitchen of the house he had once called home, they faced each other with a fragile silence. Clara's eyes were pools of sorrow, her hands trembling as she reached for a chipped cup of cold tea. "Elias," she whispered, voice barely audible over the distant hum, "you were losing yourself in this place. You have to let go." But he shook his head, the lines of obsession etched deeply into his face. "I can't. Not yet. There's something beneath it all, something we have to understand." She looked away, a shadow crossing her features. Or maybe some things are better left buried. Their words hung heavy in the stale air, a fragile bridge threatened by the relentless tide of madness. That night, Elias sat alone in his room, the mirror's fragmented reflection staring back at him like a shattered soul. A sudden movement caught his eye, a shifting shadow at the edge of the room. He turned sharply, heart hammering, but saw nothing but darkness pressing against the thin walls. Then a flicker, a grotesque, amorphous shape coalesced briefly in the gloom. The nameless entity, both terrifying and ineffable, its form a writhing mass of industrial decay and suppressed trauma. It pulsed with a cosmic indifference that crushed Elias's spirit, a reminder that escape was a lie. The entity's presence dissolved into the fog, leaving Elias breathless and trembling. His reflection in the mirror no longer seemed his own, but a vessel for the town's collective suffering, a fractured, haunted visage doomed to endure the eternal unrest. As dawn approached, the oppressive atmosphere of the town seeped into his bones. Elias sank to the floor, clutching his head as the whispered voices crescendoed into a maddening chorus. The boundary between self and nightmare had shattered, and all that remained was the endless, fracturing echo of a mind unraveling. And still, the mirror waited, its shards reflecting 1,000 broken faces, none whole, none safe. The nightmare was no longer outside, it was within. But even as despair threatened to consume him, a faint spark flickered in the depths of his fractured mind, a question, a challenge, a desperate hope. Could he reclaim himself before the darkness claimed him utterly? Or was he forever lost to the shared madness that gripped the town? The mirror cracked again, a new fracture splitting the surface, and Elias's eyes met those of his reflection, fractured, haunted, human. Somewhere beyond the breaking, a sliver of resistance remained. The heavy fog clung to the crumbling streets like a suffocating shroud, muffling every sound except the distant, relentless groan of the mines, an aching lament from the bowels of the earth that seemed to echo the town's own decay. Elias Thorne stood at the threshold of the old mining shaft, its iron gates twisted and rusted, the skeletal remains of machinery looming like forgotten sentinels. The air was thick with soot and the bitter tang of rust, a scent that had become synonymous with the town's slow death. His breath came in shallow gasps, not from exertion but from the weight of despair that pressed upon his chest. Each step he took was measured, deliberate, as if the ground itself might betray him. The sky above was a roiling canvas of smoke and ash, a darkened sun casting pale, sickly light over the landscape. The oppressive industrial haze swallowed the horizon, rendering the world outside the town a forgotten myth. Inside the dim confines of his clinic, Elias sought refuge amidst the chaos, a sanctuary of sorts cluttered with yellowed medical texts, glass vials, and worn journals filled with meticulous notes. The flickering candlelight cast grotesque shadows that danced across the peeling walls, mirroring the monstrous forms that haunted his waking nightmares. He traced trembling fingers over the words he had scrawled, desperate for a breakthrough that refused to come. His journals had become a testament not only to the town's affliction, but to his unraveling mind. The lines between reality and nightmare blurred with each passing day. Visions seeping into his consciousness like the insidious smoke that seeped through every crack of the town. He scribbled feverishly, chasing elusive patterns within the collective madness. But the answers remained maddeningly out of reach. One evening, as the sky wept cold rain, Martha Crowley appeared at his door, her weathered face etched with lines carved by years of hardship and fear. Her shawl, soaked and heavy, clung to her like a funeral veil. She spoke in a voice threaded with urgency and resignation. "Elias, you pushed too far. The town is unraveling, and with it, any hope we clutch slips through our fingers like smoke." The darkness grows stronger. Elias met her gaze, the fire of his determination flickering but not yet extinguished. "I cannot surrender to despair, Martha. There must be something, some way to break the cycle." She shook her head slowly, eyes clouded with sorrow. "Sometimes the curse is older than the minds, older than any of us. We are but shadows trapped in its grip." Their conversation was cut short by a sudden, harsh knock. Deputy Harris entered, his stern features softened by fatigue, but hardened by the futility he now faced. "The town's falling apart, Doc. The people. They were losing their minds faster than we can keep track. There's talk of violence, and no one's safe anymore." Elias nodded grimly. "I fear the entity's hold is tightening. Days blurred into nights, and nights into a waking nightmare." Clara Thorne, Elias' estranged sister, came to him one stormy evening, the thunder rumbling like the earth's own lament. She stood quietly in the doorway, her pale face a mask of distant sorrow. The years of silence and separation hung heavy between them. "Elias," she whispered, voice barely audible over the rain, "you were losing yourself, this town. It's consuming you." He looked into her eyes, the last tether to his humanity fraying. "I'm trying, Clara, for all of us." But even his words felt hollow, swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere that had claimed the town and now threatened to claim him. The decay was no longer just physical. It seeped into the minds and souls of the townsfolk. Shops shuttered, streets emptied, and the once faint whispers of the nameless entity grew into a cacophony of dread. Elias' efforts to rally the remaining sane residents faltered against the tide of madness. Medical treatments were powerless against an affliction that was as much spiritual and cosmic as it was corporeal. The industrial skeleton of the town groaned under the weight of its own history, exploitation, tragedy, and a curse born of generations of suppressed fears. Elias felt the crushing inevitability of it all, a darkness that no light could penetrate. In his heart, the last flicker of hope dimmed, threatening to die out completely. Yet even as the shadows closed in, Elias clung to the slender thread of resistance, the fragile memory of a time before the nightmare. The town was slipping beyond reach, but in the depths of his despair, a question lingered. Was there truly no escape, or was the last light simply waiting to be reignited? The air hung heavy with a suffocating stillness as Elias stood at the edge of the mining pit, the ground beneath his feet trembling faintly with the endless thrum of unseen machinery. The sun, a sickly orb swallowed by a thick haze of dust and smog, bled its dying light across the barren landscape, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to writhe and pulse with a life of their own. Around him, the town lay shrouded in an oppressive silence, broken only by the distant, mechanical drone that gnawed ceaselessly at the nerves of those who remained awake. Elias' breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, visible in the chill air as thin clouds of frost. His sharp eyes, once so keen and resolute, now betrayed the exhaustion that clawed at his mind. He watched the shadowy figures moving through the streets, gaunt faces turned upward, eyes wide and unblinking, reflecting the faint glow of the dying sun like hollow mirrors of despair. These were not mere sleepless souls. They were prisoners of a waking nightmare, caught in a trap woven from their own fear and the insidious presence lurking beneath the surface of their reality. The doctor's footsteps echoed hollowly as he turned away from the pit, heading toward the town hall, where a flicker of fragile hope still clung to the ragged edges of the community. Inside, the air was stale and thick with unease. The faint murmur of voices rose and fell like a broken tide, weaving through the dimly lit chamber where the townsfolk sat clustered together, their faces pale and drawn, eyes glazed with a mix of exhaustion and terror. At the front stood Martha Crowley, her weathered features tight with determination despite the tremor in her voice. She clutched a worn shawl around her shoulders as she addressed the fractured assembly. "We cannot give in," she urged, her words trembling but resolute. "This town has survived worse. We must hold on to what little hope remains." But the weight of despair was a cruel companion, and it hung heavy in the air, smothering her words before they could take root. Whispers of doubt and fear rippled through the crowd, a fragile thread of resistance fraying beneath the relentless pressure of the entity's influence. Elias felt the hopelessness seep into his bones, a cold and unyielding certainty that the nightmare had already claimed them all. Later, in the dim sanctuary of his cluttered office, Elias pored over the scattered pages of his journals and notes. Ink smudged beneath trembling fingers as the shadows cast by the flickering lamp twisted and danced along the walls. In the corner of his vision, the amorphous shape of the entity pulsed and shifted, a grotesque silhouette of industrial decay and cosmic dread, feeding eagerly on the fragile threads of his dwindling sanity. He could no longer tell where his thoughts ended and the nightmare began. Hallucinations bled into reality. Whispered voices echoed in the silence, gnawing at his resolve. The knowledge that the entity was not just an external horror, but a manifestation of collective trauma and madness weighed heavily upon him. Every attempt to resist seemed to tighten its grip, drawing the town deeper into its inescapable abyss. A sudden tremor shook the foundations of the town, the very air vibrating with a terrible energy as the entity surged in power. Elias found himself huddled in the cramped basement of the clinic alongside Martha and the reluctant Deputy Harris. The walls closed in, their surfaces seeming to breathe with a slow, malevolent rhythm. The otherworldly whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that seemed to seep directly into their minds, unraveling the last threads of resistance. "There is no escape," Elias whispered, his voice cracked and hollow. This thing feeds on our fear, our madness. It's endless." Martha's eyes glistened with unshed tears, her stoic facade cracking for the first time. Deputy Harris's grip tightened on his flashlight, his skepticism eroded by the palpable terror that surrounded them. Outside, the town continued its restless vigil, eyes wide open, minds captive in a shared nightmare that stretched beyond the bounds of time and reason. Elias's last thoughts before darkness claimed him were a bitter lament for a community lost, a soul broken by the cruel certainty that some horrors are eternal, and no light remains in the abyss. The nightmare endured, a cosmic trap woven from despair and industrial decay, binding the town and its inhabitants in a waking death from which there was no reprieve. And in the heart of this living nightmare stood Elias Thorne, a man shattered by knowledge and madness, forever lost to the suffocating shadows of the town that sleeps with its eyes open. Yet even as the darkness closed in, a faint, trembling question lingered in the air: if escape was impossible, if resistance only fed the horror, then what meaning remained in their fight? The answer, like the nightmare itself, slipped away into the void, leaving only the unyielding weight of eternal dread. The oppressive hum of the unseen machinery continued unabated, a relentless reminder that the town's torment was far from over, and that the entity's hunger would never be sated. In this place where sanity frayed and hope withered, the only certainty was the endless night that awaited them all. Drudra. Elias Thorne sat hunched over a battered wooden desk in the corner of his dimly lit room, the faint glow of a flickering kerosene lamp casting long, wavering shadows across the cracked walls. Outside, the ever-present hum of the mining machinery thrummed relentlessly, a mechanical heartbeat that echoed the ceaseless unrest within the town. His pen trembled as it scratched across the yellowed pages of his journal, each word a fragile thread weaving the tapestry of a nightmare from which there was no waking. The eyes remain open, he wrote, but the minds are captive, trapped in a dream that is not their own, a shared hallucination woven from fear, trauma, and the decay that seeps from the earth beneath our feet. I have become both witness and prisoner of this dreadful truth. His gaunt face, framed by unkempt hair and shadowed by exhaustion, reflected the erosion of hope that had consumed him. The relentless insomnia that plagued the town had long since invaded his own nights, twisting dreams into grotesque visions that blurred into his waking hours. The boundary between what was real and what was nightmare had dissolved until it was impossible to say where one ended and the other began. Outside his window, the streets lay cloaked in a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the distant clang of iron and the muffled footsteps of the townsfolk. Their faces, pale and drawn, bore the hollow, haunted look of those caught in the grip of a shared dream-awaking nightmare, where eyes stared unblinking into a void that devoured individuality and sanity alike. Martha Crowley emerged from the shadows of her weathered home, wrapped tightly in a worn shawl that seemed to absorb the cold night air. Her voice, a trembling whisper, carried a fragile defiance as she murmured protective charms against the darkness that crept ever closer. Though her words offered scant comfort, they were a beacon of resistance in a town suffocated by despair. Elias' thoughts drifted to Samuel Rook, whose descent into madness had been both a warning and a symptom of the town's unraveling. The former miner's frantic ramblings had once been dismissed as paranoia, but now they resonated with a tragic clarity. The entity, the nameless presence that lurked beneath the surface of reality, fed on the collective fear and insomnia, ensuring the nightmare endured. His own reflection caught his attention, a cracked mirror hanging crookedly on the wall. He stared long and hard, watching as the familiar features contorted and fractured into grotesque shapes that seemed alive with malevolent intent. The image shifted and shimmered, blurring the line between self and other, reality and madness. A shiver coursed through him as the oppressive weight of the entity's influence pressed against his mind. The curse of the mining town was not merely a legacy of industrial exploitation or the trauma of generations past, it was a cosmic affliction, an eternal trap woven into the very fabric of their existence. In these final moments, Elias acknowledged the futility of his quest. There was no cure, no escape from the shared nightmare. The town was a living tome, its residents condemned to wander with eyes wide open yet forever lost within the depths of a monstrous dream. He set down his pen, the journal now a testament to despair and the fragility of the human mind under relentless siege. His breath came in shallow gasps as the echoes of the void whispered promises of oblivion. Outside, the machinery ceased for a moment, the silence stretching thin and taut like a held breath. Then, as if summoned by some unseen will, the town awoke once more within its unending nightmare, eyes open, minds captive, and souls tethered to a horror that would endure beyond the end of time. A final entry etched itself into Elias' journal, a haunting refrain that would linger in the shadows long after his voice was silenced. We are awake. Yet we sleep forever, bound to the dream that devours us whole. The lamp flickered, then dimmed, plunging the room into darkness. Outside, the shared nightmare continued, eternal and unyielding. In the dim, suffocating depths of the abandoned mining shaft, Dr. Elias Thorne found himself swallowed by shadows that seemed to breathe and pulse with a life of their own. The air was thick with the stench of rusted metal and earth decay, a tangible weight pressing against his chest. The flickering light of his lantern cast grotesque shapes upon the jagged walls, shapes that writhed and shifted with a sinister intent. It was here, in this desolation, that the nameless entity revealed itself not as a form to be understood, but as an ever-changing mass of shadow and despair. Elias' heart pounded unevenly, a frantic rhythm that echoed the unrelenting pulse of the entity. Its presence was not a creature in any traditional sense, but a manifestation of the town's accumulated trauma and industrial ruin. He glimpsed fleeting grotesqueries within its amorphous shape, twisted faces, anguished limbs, and mechanical parts fused in impossible configurations. Each flicker of its shifting form threatened to unravel his sanity, a kaleidoscope of horror that defied comprehension. He tried to speak, to summon words of defiance, but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence that clung to the cavernous space. The entity seemed to absorb his resistance, feeding on the fear and helplessness that radiated from him. As he stood frozen, a cold realization settled like a stone in his gut. This was no adversary to be vanquished through reason or medicine. It was a cosmic force, indifferent and eternal, woven into the very fabric of the town's existence. Outside the shaft, the townsfolk moved like ghosts caught in a waking nightmare. Their faces blurred as if smeared by invisible hands, merging into a single, undulating mass of restless eyes and whispered fears. Elias watched through a veil of tears as individuality dissolved, replaced by a collective consciousness, shackled to the entity's will. The once vibrant community was now a hive of murmurs and tremors, their shared torment an echo of suppressed histories and unspoken horrors. In a broken mirror shattered on the dusty ground, Elias caught sight of his own reflection fractured and distorted into a mosaic of madness. His sharp eyes, once instruments of careful analysis, flickered with the shadows of doubt and despair. The image multiplied and twisted, reflecting not only his personal unraveling, but the psychic disintegration of the town itself. Each shard revealed a fragment of his fears, the failure to heal, the loss of self, and the encroaching void that threatened to consume all meaning. The suffocating silence deepened as the entity's presence seeped into every corner of the mining town. Shadows lengthened and pooled like ink, swallowing the last flickers of light and hope. Elias stood alone amid the ruins, a solitary figure caught in the midst of an eternal nightmare. His breath came in shallow gasps, and the cold air bit at his skin as the oppressive atmosphere pressed closer, a tangible reminder of the cosmic indifference that governed his fate. Despite the overwhelming despair, a faint ember of resolve flickered within Elias. He clung to the fragile hope that understanding, even in the face of the incomprehensible, might offer some form of salvation. Yet, as the entity's amorphous form loomed, he recognized the futility of resistance. The town's curse was woven too deeply into its soil and souls, a legacy born of exploitation, fear, and madness that no single man could undo. The nameless entity was not merely a monster to be fought. It was an embodiment of the collapse of individuality and the dark shadow of industrial decay. It was a cosmic reminder of humanity's insignificance, a force that fed on the very essence of the townspeople's minds and dreams. Elias felt himself slipping, the boundaries between waking and dreaming dissolving into an endless void where time and identity lost meaning. As the chapter closed, Elias' figure faded into the encroaching darkness, swallowed by the presence that haunted the town. The lingering unease and cosmic dread settled like a shroud over the narrative, leaving the reader suspended in a moment of profound existential horror. The question remained, could there ever be escape from this eternal nightmare? Or was the town forever bound to its nameless, ineffable tormentor? The nameless presence, elusive and omnipresent, continued its silent dominion, a grotesque symphony of despair playing out beneath the surface of reality. Elias' confrontation was not an end, but a prelude to the inescapable truth. Some horrors transcend understanding, eternal and shared, woven into the fragile tapestry of human existence. The town slept with its eyes open, trapped in a waking nightmare from which there was no awakening. And somewhere, deep beneath the earth and minds alike, the entity pulsed, waiting, watching, forever hungry. The nightmare endures.
True.
Elias Thorne stepped off the rattling train onto the cracked, soot-stained platform of the mining town, a place that seemed caught in perpetual twilight despite the late hour. The air was thick with the acrid scent of coal dust and machine oil, the distant clatter of unseen machinery pulsing like a heartbeat beneath the earth. Already, Elias felt the weight of the place pressing against his chest, a heavy, unyielding presence that seemed to seep from the very ground. His sharp eyes swept over the cluster of figures scattered about the platform. There was something off about them. Their eyes, those unnervingly wide, unblinking eyes, were fixed outward, staring past the world as if caught in an endless vigil. Their movements were jittery, twitching with an unnatural energy that suggested exhaustion yet denied rest. It was as though the town itself refused the gift of sleep. Elias adjusted the collar of his worn coat and began his slow walk toward the town center, the uneven pavement crunching beneath his boots. The buildings loomed like sentinels of rust and soot, their windows dark and hollow, reflecting the ashen sky above. The skeletal frames of mining rigs pierced the horizon, casting long, grotesque shadows that stretched across the streets like grasping fingers. At the edge of the main street, a dimly lit tavern offered a faint beacon of warmth. Inside, the murmur of hushed conversations mingled with the clink of glass. Elias made his way to the bar, where a woman with weathered features and a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders regarded him with steady, unyielding eyes. "You read the doctor, aren't you?" she asked softly, her voice roughened by years of smoke and hardship. "Dr. Elias Thorne," he replied, offering a thin smile. "Just arrived." She nodded, her gaze never wavering. "This town doesn't sleep, doctor. Not like it should." Elias felt a chill creep down his spine. "What do you mean?" Eyes wide open all night, minds trapped in dreams that gnaw at their sanity. "The miners, their families, nobody rests here anymore." Before Elias could respond, the tavern door slammed open and a disheveled man stumbled inside. His eyes darted frantically, wild and unfocused. "They're rewatching!" The eyes that never close. The dreams that devour us all. He shouted, voice cracking with desperation. The room fell silent, patrons exchanging wary glances. The man's name was Samuel Rook, a former miner whose recent misfortune had left him an outcast. Elias noted the trimmer in his hands and the haunted look that clung to his every word. "Calm down, Samuel," Martha said firmly, though the tension in her voice betrayed her own fears. "Not everyone's ready to hear such talk." Elias watched the scene unfold, the stark reality of the town's affliction settling over him like a shroud. This was no ordinary insomnia. It was something deeper, more sinister, a collective nightmare that gripped the community in its relentless grasp. That night, as Elias settled into the frayed bed of his rented room, the oppressive hum of distant machinery lulled him not to sleep but to a restless awareness. Outside, the town's eyes remained wide open, staring into the void, waiting for what he could not yet say. But Elias knew, deep within his bones, that his arrival had stirred something long dormant, and that the shadows of this wakeful town would not easily release him from their grasp. He opened his journal, the scratch of his pen breaking the silence. "Day 1, he wrote, "and already the weight of this place presses on my mind. The residents suffer from a sleeplessness unlike any I have seen. Their eyes, wide and unwavering, speak of horrors I have yet to comprehend. I must begin my investigation carefully, for beneath this industrial decay lies a darkness that threatens to consume us all." Outside, the night stretched on, endless and unyielding, as the town that sleeps with its eyes open drifted deeper into its waking nightmare.